My husband leaned in close at the most exclusive restaurant in New York. "Try not to embarrass me," he hissed, shoving my handbag under the table. "The CEO is arriving soon, and he does not need to see my unemployed wife dragging me down." I just smiled and took a sip of water. He had no idea the billionaire CEO he was desperately waiting to impress was about to walk through those doors, bow his head, and call me big sister. "My name is Nora. I am 34 years old, and until tonight I thought my marriage was just difficult. I did not realize it was built on a complete delusion." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch an arrogant person dig their own grave. The private dining room at Le Bernardin was suffocating despite the high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. Derek, my husband of 5 years, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. He pulled out a plush velvet chair for his mother Brenda, and then rushed around the table to do the same for his sister. I stood there waiting for him to at least acknowledge me, but he just snapped his fingers and pointed to the chair closest to the kitchen door. "Sit down, Nora, and please tuck that cheap purse away," he ordered. I slid into the seat, pulling my simple black leather tote onto my lap. It was not cheap. It was a custom piece from Italy gifted to me by one of my board members. But Derek only recognized flashy logos and loud branding. To him, I was just his stay-at-home wife, a failed freelance consultant who barely scraped together grocery money. That was the narrative he liked, and that was the narrative I let him believe. It made him feel powerful. Brenda adjusted her heavy pearl necklace and scoffed loudly. "Derek is right, Nora. You really should have dressed up. Look at you. A plain black dress. You look like you are going to a funeral, not the most important dinner of my son's life. You need to understand the stakes here." Derek is a vice president of business development now. He is stepping into the elite circles. You are lucky he even brought you along to experience a place like this. I looked at Brenda. Her entire identity revolved around Derek being her golden child. She had spent the last 5 years reminding me how I was dragging him down and how he could have married a woman with a real career. I just gave her a polite nod. I knew exactly what the stakes were tonight. What neither Brenda nor Derek knew was that the Omnitech contract Derek was sweating over had been sitting on my desk for review since Tuesday. Derek kept checking his reflection in his phone screen, smoothing his tie. He had spent $10,000 on a custom-tailored suit just for this evening, putting it on a credit card he thought I did not know about. He was desperately trying to project the image of a seasoned corporate player. He leaned over the table, grabbing my wrist tightly. "Listen to me, Nora. When Leo gets here, you do not speak unless spoken to. You do not talk about your little freelance projects. You do not talk about our house. Just smile and nod. If he asks you what you do, tell him you manage our household. Understand?" I pulled my wrist out of his grip, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "I understand perfectly, Derek. You want me to be invisible." Brenda slammed her water glass down, making the ice clink sharply. "Do not take that tone with him. He is under immense pressure. Do you know how hard he works while you sit at home doing nothing? He carries the financial burden of this entire family. You should be grateful he does not make you pay rent for living in his beautiful house." I bit the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing. The financial burden. That was a hilarious choice of words. Derek made a good salary, sure, but he spent it as fast as he earned it on luxury cars, designer watches, and high-end country club memberships to keep up appearances. The only reason we lived in our beautiful brownstone in Brooklyn was because I paid the entire down payment in cash before we even got married. But Derek had convinced his family he was the sole provider and I was his charity case. I let him have that illusion because I valued peace over being right. But peace was no longer an option tonight. "You are absolutely right, Brenda," I said softly. "Derek works very hard at projecting an image." Derek glared at me, his jaw clenched tight. "I am warning you, Nora. Omnitech is a billion-dollar unicorn. If I land this partnership, I get a massive promotion and stock options. My entire future relies on making Leo see me as a peer. Do not ruin this for me because of your petty jealousy." "I am not jealous, Derek," I replied, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "I just hope you actually know what you are doing." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. I know exactly what I am doing. I have been analyzing Omnitech for months. I know everything about their operations. The only thing I do not know is the identity of their anonymous majority shareholder. But once I get in with Leo, I will find that out too. He was so proud of his corporate espionage. He had no idea the anonymous majority shareholder he was talking about was sitting right across from him being ordered to hide her handbag. Right then, the heavy oak door to the private room swung open. Derek jumped out of his chair, instantly plastering a massive fake smile on his face. He smoothed his jacket and rushed forward, his hand extended eagerly. "Mr. CEO, it is such an honor." He began, his voice dripping with syrupy sweetness. But the smile vanished from Derek's face when he saw who was actually standing in the doorway. It was not the billionaire tech genius he was waiting to worship. It was Jamal. Jamal was married to Derek's sister, and he was the quintessential finance bro. As a highly aggressive African-American man who had climbed the ruthless ranks of a Manhattan brokerage firm, Jamal never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how much money he managed. He strolled into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his custom shirt to make sure his massive gold Rolex caught the light of the chandelier. He looked at Derek with a smug, arrogant grin, ready to start his own circus of humiliation. Jamal smirked as he walked toward the table, taking his time. He loved an audience. Derek let out a shaky breath, clearly disappointed that it was not the billionaire CEO, but he quickly masked it with a forced laugh. "Jamal, my man, you made it," Derek said, clapping him on the shoulder. Jamal did not even look at Derek. His eyes were already fixed on me. He pulled out the chair next to Brenda and sat down heavily, propping his elbows on the table so the gold Rolex caught the light perfectly. He tapped the face of the watch with his thick fingers. "Just closed a massive portfolio restructuring for a client in Dubai," Jamal announced, his booming voice echoing in the private room. "They threw in a bonus, so I figured why not upgrade the wristwear. You like it, Derek. It is probably worth more than your entire annual bonus, if you even get one this year." Derek swallowed hard, his fake smile faltering for a second. "That is incredible, Jamal. Really impressive." Brenda beamed at her son-in-law. "We are so proud of you, Jamal. You are such a fantastic provider for my daughter. A real man of finance." She shot a pointed glare at me. "Not everyone understands the kind of pressure men like you and Derek face." Jamal leaned back, crossing his arms behind his head. He looked me up and down with absolute disdain. "It is a tough world, Brenda. You have to be aggressive. You have to be a shark." He paused, letting his gaze lock onto mine. "Speaking of which, Nora, how is the little freelance consulting business going? Did you even manage to pull in $500 this month? Or are you still just playing pretend on your laptop all day?" I kept my expression completely neutral. "I am doing just fine, Jamal," I replied smoothly. "My projects keep me very busy." He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that made a nearby waiter flinch. "Busy? Right. Listen to her, Derek. She is busy." Jamal shook his head in mock pity. "Man, I do not know how you do it. Carrying the weight of a mortgage, car payments, and a wife who thinks sending a few emails constitutes a career. You are a saint, Derek. If my wife tried to pull that, I would have cut off her credit cards years ago." Derek puffed out his chest, looking entirely too pleased with the validation. "It is not easy, Jamal. I carry a lot on my shoulders. I just want her to understand how the real corporate world works. That is why I brought her tonight, to see what real success looks like when Leo arrives." Brenda reached over and patted Derek's hand. "You are too good to her, sweetheart. You always have been. She is incredibly lucky you do not demand rent from her." I took another sip of my water, enjoying the absolute absurdity of the conversation. Jamal was a mid-level broker at a firm that was currently swimming in high-risk margin loans. I knew this because my venture capital fund, Apex Horizon, held the paper on a significant chunk of his firm's debt. He was bragging about a Rolex while sitting on a financial landmine that I could detonate with one phone call. And Derek was playing the weary provider while secretly drowning in fraudulent debt he had taken out against the house I owned. They were two clowns performing in a circus I funded. "I am very lucky," I said, my voice dripping with an icy sweetness they were too arrogant to notice. It is fascinating listening to you both talk about high finance. Truly educational. Jamal smirked, taking my sarcasm as genuine submission. Glad you are taking notes, Nora. Maybe you will learn something. You see, in my line of work, we do not wait for handouts. We take what we want. We dominate. Right at that moment, the private dining room door opened again, and the head sommelier stepped in, carrying a leather-bound wine list. He approached the table with a polite nod. Good evening. May I offer you some selections while we wait for your final guest? Jamal snatched the menu right out of the sommelier's hands before Derek could even reach for it. Oh, we are definitely drinking tonight, Jamal declared, flipping to the most expensive section at the back of the book. Since Derek here is about to land his little tech contract and become a big shot, I think we need to celebrate properly. Jamal ran his finger down the list of reserve wines. His eyes gleamed with malice as he looked up at me. He was not just ordering wine, he was setting a trap. I could see the exact moment the idea formed in his head to humiliate me further. We will take the Chateau Margaux, Jamal told the sommelier, pointing to a bottle. And bring 2 of them. We want to make sure everyone has plenty. The sommelier nodded professionally. Excellent choice, sir. I will bring those right out. As the sommelier left the room, Jamal leaned across the table toward me, his gold watch clinking against the glass. Those bottles run about $2,000 apiece, Nora. Since Derek works so hard to keep a roof over your head, it is only fair that you cover the drinks tonight. Consider it your contribution to the family. Or does your little freelance budget not stretch that far? My name is Diana. I am 34 years old, and until a few weeks ago, my husband treated me like the punchline to a terrible joke. We were sitting at the most exclusive Michelin star restaurant in Chicago when he leaned in, his breath hot against my ear, and whispered that I should try not to embarrass him with my pathetic little plant shop stories. He had no idea that the very CEO he was sweating to impress was about to walk through the doors, freeze in his tracks, bow his head, and call me big sister. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of someone who underestimated your true power. The crystal chandeliers of Le Cirque cast a warm golden glow over the crisp white tablecloths, but the atmosphere at our table was freezing cold. I sat quietly in my simple charcoal wrap dress, tracing the rim of my water glass. Across from me sat my husband Bradley, 36 years old, and practically vibrating with nervous ambition. He was the vice president of business development at a major tech firm, and tonight was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his career. He was hosting a critical dinner with his boss, Mr. Montgomery, desperately trying to lay the groundwork for a massive corporate merger with Apex AI. And then there was my mother-in-law, Patricia, who had invited herself along because she never missed an opportunity to drink expensive wine on someone else's dime and pretend she belonged to Chicago's elite. Bradley kept checking his luxury watch, his leg bouncing under the table. The elusive CEO of Apex AI was already 3 hours late. Bradley had ordered plate after plate of Wagyu beef caviar-topped appetizers and vintage Bordeaux, racking up an absurd tab just to keep Mr. Montgomery from leaving. To cover the awkward tension of the agonizing wait, Bradley and Patricia did what they always did. They used me as their personal punching bag to deflect attention from his own failures. Mr. Montgomery took a polite sip of his Cabernet and turned his attention to me, asking how my business was doing. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Bradley let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Oh, Diana just plays around with some dirt and pots," Bradley said, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "She runs a little plant shop downtown. It keeps her busy while I handle the real work. I just let her have her little hobby so she does not get bored at home while the adults make money." Patricia immediately chimed in, leaning across the table with a patronizing smile plastered on her face. "We are just so thankful Bradley is such a good provider," she told Mr. Montgomery, projecting her voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "He practically rescued her. He pays the mortgage, covers the car notes, handles all the big boy bills. Not many men would carry a wife who contributes so little, but my son has such a generous heart." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. They loved this narrative. For the 5 years we had been married, Bradley had carefully constructed this illusion that he was my absolute savior. He constantly mocked my simple clothes, my dirt-stained fingernails, and the modest storefront I visited every day. I never bothered to correct him. I never mentioned that my little plant shop was just a quiet sanctuary where I went to escape his massive ego. I certainly never mentioned that I had bought our entire house in cash before the wedding, or that the mortgage he bragged about paying was actually a secret second loan he took out behind my back just 3 months ago to fund a lavish lifestyle he absolutely could not afford. The dinner dragged on in excruciating fashion. Mr. Montgomery was growing increasingly agitated by the minute, checking his own phone and muttering about the blatant lack of professionalism from the Apex AI team. Bradley was sweating profusely through his tailored suit, desperately trying to keep the conversation going. Every time I tried to speak or engage, Bradley would shoot me a vicious glare or step hard on my foot under the table. Finally, Mr. Montgomery wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and threw it down. "It is obvious they are not coming, Bradley. I have wasted my entire evening here." Right on cue, the waiter approached discreetly, holding a sleek black leather folder. He placed it directly in the center of the table. I could clearly see the total printed at the bottom of the receipt: $4,200. Bradley stared at the staggering numbers, the color draining from his face. He patted his jacket pockets with theatrical exaggeration, putting on a terrible performance of a man who had suddenly misplaced his wallet. Then a malicious smirk spread across his face, replacing his panic with pure cruelty. He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with a vicious challenge. "Actually, Mr. Montgomery, my beautiful wife insisted on treating us tonight," Bradley announced loudly, pushing the leather folder across the table until it hit my plate. "She wants to show her appreciation for everything I do for her." "Right, Diana. Go ahead, sweetheart. Show Mr. Montgomery how supportive you are." He was cornering me intentionally. He knew the joint credit card in my purse had a strict limit that barely covered weekly groceries. A limit he had deliberately set himself to control my spending. He wanted my card to decline in front of his boss. He wanted to humiliate me to prove his absolute dominance and to punish me for simply existing in his presence when his own career was falling apart. I looked down at the leather folder resting against my plate, then back up at my husband. His smile was so artificially sweet, it made my stomach turn. He knew exactly what he was doing. I opened my purse and pulled out the silver plastic card he had magnanimously given me shortly after our honeymoon. I placed it on the small silver tray and handed it to the waiter. The young man nodded professionally and stepped away toward the payment terminal near the bustling bar. The silence at our table was suffocating. Mr. Montgomery was pointedly looking at his phone, swiping through his screen, clearly wishing he were anywhere else but trapped in this uncomfortable domestic display. Patricia was practically vibrating with glee, sipping her wine, as she waited for the inevitable explosion she knew her son had engineered. It took less than 2 minutes. The waiter returned, his professional demeanor slipping just a fraction, a slight flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. He leaned down and placed the folder back on the table, keeping his voice carefully low to preserve my dignity. "I am so sorry, Mom," he murmured, avoiding my eyes. "The card has been declined." Bradley let out a loud, dramatic sigh, throwing his hands up in the air. The sudden noise made several heads turn at the adjacent tables. "Declined," he said, raising his voice so everyone nearby could hear his fabricated exasperation. "Are you serious, Diana? You told me you managed the accounts this week." Patricia gasped, clutching the pearl necklace at her throat in a display of theatrical shock. "Oh, Bradley," she said loudly, "how humiliating for you. In front of Mr. Montgomery, no less. I simply cannot believe she would put you in this position." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I did not blush. I did not stammer. I did not apologize. I just watched my husband perform his little play. Bradley pulled out his own heavy metal corporate card and tossed it onto the tray, glaring at me with manufactured disgust. "I should have known better," he sneered, leaning across the table so his words would cut deeper. I really should not have expected someone with your background to handle a real dinner. You grew up clipping coupons and buying secondhand clothes, Diana. You do not understand how the real world operates. You simply do not have the class or the financial literacy to sit at a table like this. Mr. Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat loudly. Bradley, please let us just settle the bill and go. The evening is over. But Bradley was not finished. He was high on the rush of putting me in my place, desperate to assert his dominance, to compensate for the fact that his career-defining meeting was turning out to be a spectacular failure. He needed a scapegoat, and I was the easiest target in the room. The CEO of Apex AI is a billionaire. Bradley continued, his voice sharp and biting. If by some miracle he actually walks through those doors tonight, I cannot have you sitting here making us look like a charity case. You have already embarrassed me enough for one evening with your cheap dress and your declined cards. Go wait in the lobby, Diana. Go sit by the coat check and do not speak to anyone. I need to salvage this meeting and your presence is a liability. Patricia smiled triumphantly, taking another long sip of her vintage Bordeaux. Go on, dear, she said dismissively, waving her manicured hand toward the front of the restaurant. Let the men handle the important business. You have done quite enough damage for one night. I looked at Bradley, taking in his flushed, angry face, his expensive tailored suit, and his absolute certainty that he held all the power in our marriage. He truly believed he was the master of my universe. He believed that forcing me to wait by the coat check, like a misbehaving child, would break my spirit. I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply picked up my modest clutch purse and stood up from the table. My unnatural calmness seemed to unnerve him for a fraction of a second, a slight flicker of confusion crossing his eyes, but his arrogant smirk quickly returned. I smoothed the skirt of my dress and turned away from the table, taking my first step toward the front lobby. But before my second step landed, the atmosphere in the restaurant completely shifted. The low murmur of wealthy diners and the clinking of crystal glasses instantly died out. The energy in the room dropped, replaced by a sudden electric tension. The grand double doors of Le Cirque heavy brass and frosted glass were suddenly thrown open with such force that the head maitre d' jumped back in surprise. 6 men in immaculate dark suits filed into the elegant entryway, their earpieces visible, their sharp gazes instantly scanning the dining room. They moved with military precision, parting down the middle to create a clear, unobstructed pathway. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Bradley gasped, practically leaping out of his chair, nearly knocking over his water glass in his frantic haste to stand at attention. Mr. Montgomery stood up so fast his heavy dining chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Patricia froze, her wineglass hovering inches from her lips. Through the parted sea of security guards, a young man stepped into the warm light of the restaurant. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit, looking completely relaxed, yet commanding absolute authority, without saying a single word. He exuded the kind of raw, untouchable power that made seasoned executives sweat. It was the elusive CEO of Apex AI, the tech visionary Bradley had been waiting 3 agonizing hours to worship. Bradley did not even wait for the young billionaire to take a full step inside the dining room. Desperation completely overrode whatever minor amount of professional decorum he possessed. He physically shoved past me to get to the front, his elbow clipping my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble a half step. He did not look back to apologize. He was entirely focused on his target. He smoothed his suit lapels with sweaty palms, his face twisting into a mask of pure corporate sycophancy. Mr. C. E.O. Bradley practically shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he rushed across the polished floor. What an absolute honor. I am Bradley, Vice President of Business Development. We have been waiting all evening for this privilege. He thrust his hand forward, eager to shake the hand of the man who held his entire career trajectory, his bonus, and his desperately desired promotion in his palm. Mr. Montgomery was right behind him, equally anxious but trying to maintain a shred of dignity. They looked like 2 desperate men begging for a lifeline. Leo did not slow his pace. He did not extend his hand. He did not even blink. The security guards moved with fluid precision, forming a subtle but impenetrable wall that forced Bradley to stumble backward to avoid a collision. Leo walked right past Bradley, as if my husband were nothing more than a misplaced chair blocking his path. The utter dismissal in that single continuous motion was devastating. Bradley stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant, his hands still suspended in the empty air, his mouth hanging open in sheer shock. Leo's eyes were fixed on one person. Me. The entire restaurant held its collective breath. You could hear a pin drop in the dining room. Patricia was gripping the edge of her seat, her eyes darting nervously between her son and the billionaire. Mr. Montgomery stood frozen, holding a freshly poured glass of wine, realizing that the most powerful man in the room was entirely ignoring their eager greetings. Leo stopped less than 2 feet away from where I stood holding my simple clutch purse. His security detail fanned out instantly, creating a secure perimeter around us, physically separating me from Bradley and his toxic family. Leo reached up and slowly removed his dark sunglasses, folding them with precise, deliberate movements. He slipped them into the breast pocket of his jacket. Then, in front of the most elite crowd in Chicago, in front of the boss who held my husband's future, and in front of the mother-in-law who had just spent the last 2 hours ridiculing my existence, the untouchable tech visionary bowed his head. It was not a casual, polite nod. It was a deep, deferential bow of absolute respect and loyalty. Big Sister Leo said. His voice was calm, clear, and carried perfectly across the dead, silent dining room. Are these people bothering you? The sound of shattering glass pierced the heavy silence like a gunshot. Mr. Montgomery had literally dropped his wine glass. The fragile crystal hit the floor, sending a spray of dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth and splashing onto his expensive leather shoes. He did not even notice the stain. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He darted frantic, panicked looks between his ambitious vice president and the woman they had both just treated like worthless trash. He suddenly remembered every cruel joke Bradley had made about my plant shop, every insult about my background, and the ultimate humiliation of the declined credit card. Mr. Montgomery realized in real time that his subordinate had just publicly humiliated the beloved older sister of the man they desperately needed to save their company. Patricia looked like all the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs. Her jaw worked soundlessly. The smug, vicious satisfaction that had defined her face all evening was entirely gone, completely eradicated, and replaced by a pale, sickly terror. She gripped the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles turned stark white, her eyes darting to me as if seeing me for the very first time. And Bradley. Bradley was a portrait of total mental collapse. His brain simply could not process the data presenting itself in front of him. The man he idolized, the billionaire he needed to impress, to secure his promotion, was treating his supposedly useless coupon-clipping wife with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. Bradley slowly turned his head toward me, the blood draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. His eyes were wide, silently pleading for this to be a hallucination, a mistake, a terrible prank. I did not rush to comfort him. I did not shrink back or play the role of the submissive, embarrassed wife he had demanded I be just moments ago. I stood tall, feeling the undeniable electric surge of power coursing through my veins. The years of biting my tongue, of accepting his disrespect, of playing small so he could feel big, all dissolved in that single glorious moment. I turned around slowly, letting the heavy silence stretch out, letting them all marinate in their sudden, suffocating panic. I looked Bradley up and down, taking my time, letting my gaze sweep over his sweating forehead, his trembling hands, and his entirely ruined pride. I offered him a smile. It was not a warm smile. It was sharp, cold, and utterly terrifying. I was just leaving, I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the quiet restaurant. But the CEO you have been waiting 3 hours for just asked me to stay. Leo looked from me to the leather folder sitting like a live grenade on the pristine white tablecloth. He did not ask what had happened. He did not need to. One look at Bradley's terrified, sweating face and the declined plastic card resting on the silver tray told him everything. Leo snapped his fingers once. The gesture was crisp and absolute. The restaurant manager, who had been hovering nervously near the bar, practically sprinted over his hands clasped together in eager subservience. "Yes, sir. How may I assist you?" the manager asked, bowing slightly. "Take that bill," Leo commanded, pointing at the folder Bradley had weaponized against me just moments ago. "Charge it along with the entire dining room service for the rest of the evening to the Vanguard Holdings corporate account. Authorization code Delta Niner." The manager's eyes widened to the size of saucers. "Right away, sir." "Thank you, sir." Bradley finally found his voice. It cracked high and pathetic, stripping away every ounce of the masculine dominance he had paraded around all evening. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands raised in a frantic, placating gesture. "Wait, hold on!" Bradley stammered, his eyes darting wildly between Leo and the manager. "Sir, there must be some kind of massive misunderstanding here. Vanguard Holdings. That is a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. Diana does not work for them. She is just a florist. She plays with dirt. She runs a tiny little plant shop down on 4th Street. You are confusing her with someone else. She is my wife. I pay her bills. I support her." Patricia nodded frantically beside him, her pearl necklace clicking against her collarbone as she trembled. "Yes, exactly. She is just a simple girl. My son handles all the finances. He is a vice president." Leo stared at Bradley. The silence that followed was heavy, dripping with absolute contempt. Then Leo began to laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers and sent a shiver down Bradley's spine. Leo snapped his fingers again. His late assistant stepped forward from the wall of security guards, opening a sleek black briefcase and producing a thick leather-bound dossier. Leo took the dossier and tossed it onto the table right over the spot where my rejected credit card had been. "A florist," Leo repeated, the amusement vanishing from his face, replaced by a lethal intensity. "You arrogant blind fool. The woman you call a florist sold her first global logistics company 5 years ago for 9 figures. She took that massive influx of capital and became the sole angel investor for my entire artificial intelligence empire. Apex AI exists because she funded it from the ground up. I am the CEO, yes, but she is the founder and chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings. She owns me. She owns the building you work in. And as of this morning, she is the primary shareholder pulling the strings on the corporate merger your bosses are begging us to sign." The blood drained from Bradley's face completely. His knees literally gave out and he collapsed back into his dining chair, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Mr. Montgomery gripped the edge of the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Patricia pressed both hands over her mouth, choking on a sob of pure terror. The realization crashed down on Bradley with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. He had spent the last 5 years mocking, belittling, and financially abusing a woman who possessed enough power to destroy his entire corporate existence with a single phone call. Desperation seized him. Bradley scrambled out of his chair and lunged toward me, completely ignoring the security guards who tensed, ready to strike him down. He fell to his knees right there on the polished hardwood floor, reaching out with trembling, sweaty hands to grab the hem of my simple charcoal wrap dress. "Diana, please." Bradley begged, tears of pure panic streaming down his face, completely abandoning any shred of his former pride. "Please, honey. You have to help me. You have to talk to him. Mr. Montgomery needs this merger to go through. My promotion depends on it. My entire bonus depends on it. We are a team. We are husband and wife. Just tell Leo to sign the papers. Please, Diana, save my career. I will do anything." I looked down at the man who had tormented me for years. I looked at the man who had tried to break my spirit to inflate his own pathetic ego, the man who had just tried to humiliate me in front of Chicago's elite. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I slowly reached down and peeled his sweating, desperate fingers off my dress one by one. I leaned in close, letting the scent of my expensive, understated perfume wash over him, and whispered directly into his ear. "You said this table is for important people. You are dismissed." I straightened my posture and turned my back on him, linking my arm through Leo's. As we turned to walk toward the private VIP dining room in the back of the restaurant, Mr. Montgomery finally erupted. The senior executive slammed his fist down on the table, ignoring the shattering plates and splashing wine. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Bradley, who was still kneeling on the floor in absolute disgrace. "You absolute idiot," Mr. Montgomery roared, his voice echoing through the entire luxury restaurant, drawing the stares of every wealthy patron in the building. "You fix this mess by tomorrow morning, Bradley. You get on your knees and you beg her for forgiveness or you are fired. Do you hear me? Fired." I stood in the kitchen the next morning watching the espresso machine drip rich dark coffee into my favorite ceramic mug. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine marble countertops. It was a beautiful, crisp Chicago morning. The sheer tranquility of the house was a stark contrast to the absolute meltdown that had occurred just 12 hours prior. Bradley had slunk through the front door around 3 in the morning, smelling of stale liquor and panic. He had locked himself in the guest bedroom without saying a single word. I had slept perfectly. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter roast when the heavy oak front door was suddenly thrown wide open. The loud crash echoed through the foyer. I did not flinch. I knew exactly who had the door code and the sheer audacity to barge in unannounced. High heels clicked aggressively against the hardwood floor, followed by the heavy, dragging footsteps of someone who had never worked a hard day in his life. Patricia marched into the kitchen, her face tight with a mixture of leftover humiliation and aggressive entitlement. Right behind her was Spencer Bradley's younger brother. Spencer was 28, chronically unemployed, and currently wearing a designer tracksuit that I knew Bradley had paid for. He reeked of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. Bradley trailed behind them looking like a whipped dog. His eyes were bloodshot and his shoulders slumped. He was hiding behind his mother, hoping she could fix the catastrophic mess he had made of his career. I expected groveling. I expected Bradley to fall to his knees just as Mr. Montgomery had ordered. But Patricia was a master of delusion. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto my clean kitchen island. "Diana, we need to have a serious talk," Patricia demanded, her voice shrill and commanding, as if last night had never happened. "You kept a massive secret from this family. Letting my son believe you were struggling while you hoarded billions of dollars is practically financial abuse. We were completely blindsided. But we are a forgiving family. We are willing to look past your deceit if you make things right today." I took another sip of my coffee, raising one eyebrow. "Make things right," I repeated, my voice devoid of any emotion. Spencer scoffed, leaning against the refrigerator and crossing his arms. "Yeah, Diana, you owe us. Since your secret billionaire brother is the big boss at Apex AI, you are going to call him right now. Tell him I want the director of operations position at his headquarters. I need a corner office, full corporate benefits, and a starting salary of at least $400,000 a year. And I want a massive signing bonus. My gaming streams are not paying the bills, and it is time you actually helped your family out." Patricia nodded vigorously, validating her youngest son's absurd delusion. "Exactly. Spencer deserves an executive role. He is incredibly gifted. And as for Bradley, you are going to call Mr. Montgomery immediately. You will tell him that Vanguard Holdings guarantees the merger, but only on the condition that Bradley is promoted to senior vice president. Furthermore, you will arrange for Bradley to receive a generous block of free equity in the new venture. It is the absolute least you can do after publicly humiliating him in front of his superior. You owe your husband that financial security." I set my coffee mug down. The sheer breathtaking audacity of these people was almost clinical. They had spent years stepping on my neck, mocking my background, and treating me like an unpaid servant. The very moment they realized I owned the ground they walked on, they demanded I carry them. "Are you completely out of your minds?" I asked smoothly. "Your son mocked me, tried to publicly humiliate me, and nearly tanked his own company because of his massive, fragile ego. You sat there at the restaurant and laughed while he tried to make me pay a bill he knew I could not cover. And now you barge into my home demanding executive titles and free equity." Patricia's face turned a dangerous shade of purple with rage. She slammed her hand flat against the marble countertop. "How dare you speak to me that way in the house I provided for you?" Patricia screamed, pointing a trembling finger right in my face. "You ungrateful little brat! I bought this house for you two." I secured the down payment. I elevated your status from a dirt-poor florist to a respectable suburban wife. You would have absolutely nothing without the foundation this family gave you. I took you out of the gutter. You owe this family everything. I stared at her, letting her desperate screeching lies hang in the quiet air of the kitchen. Bradley was staring at the floor, absolutely refusing to make eye contact with me. He knew the truth, but his mother's gaslighting had always been his favorite shield. I turned my back on them. I walked straight past the pantry to a large framed botanical print hanging on the wall. I pulled the heavy wooden frame aside, revealing a digital keypad flush against the drywall. I punched in a 6-digit code. The heavy steel door of the hidden wall safe clicked open. Bradley let out a confused, strangled gasp. He had lived in this house for 5 years and never knew the safe existed. I reached inside and pulled out a thick legal manila folder. I walked back to the kitchen island and slammed the original notarized property deed down right next to Patricia's designer handbag. I bought this house in cash before the wedding. I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. My name is the only one on the original title. I let Patricia think she helped because Bradley begged me to protect his fragile pride. But did Bradley tell you about the second mortgage he secretly took out against it 3 months ago? The revelation hit Patricia like a physical blow. Her jaw dropped, her perfectly applied lipstick forming a harsh, stunned circle. She whipped her head toward her golden child, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate denial. The entire foundation of her pride, her constant boasting at the country club about her wealthy son buying a luxury home for his poor wife, was a complete fabrication. Bradley had not rescued me. He was drowning, and he had been using my assets as a life raft to keep his head above water. A second mortgage! Patricia gasped, the air rushing out of her lungs. Bradley, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not forge documents to borrow money against a house you do not even own. Bradley backed away from the kitchen island, his hands raised in a frantic, trembling gesture. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an exit. Mom, listen to me, he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. It was just a temporary cash flow problem, a short-term bridge loan. I made some aggressive investments that went sideways, but I was going to pay it back the second the Apex AI merger closed, and my executive bonus hit my account. Spencer threw his hands up in the air, his face twisting with sudden vicious rage. Wait, so you are broke? Spencer yelled, his entitlement instantly converting into anger. You promised to fund my gaming channel setup next month. You promised me $50,000 for equipment and marketing. You said you had endless capital coming in. Bradley rounded on his younger brother, his panic morphing into desperate cruelty. Grow up, Spencer. I am drowning in debt trying to keep up appearances for Mom's ridiculous social circle and your lazy, unemployed lifestyle. I do not have a single dime to give you. I am entirely tapped out. Patricia gripped her chest, hyperventilating as the reality crashed down on her. Her vice president's son, the man she claimed had saved me from the gutter, was a complete fraud. But her toxic pride absolutely refused to let her blame him. She spun around to face me, her eyes wild with desperate malice. You drove him to this, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You hid your wealth from him. You forced him to take out loans to maintain his status because you were too selfish to support your own husband. This is your fault. I did not even have the chance to respond to her pathetic attempt at gaslighting before the heavy oak front door swung open once again. Steady, confident footsteps echoed down the hallway, moving with a deliberate rhythm that completely contrasted with Patricia's frantic stomping and Spencer's lazy shuffle. Jamal walked into the kitchen. He was 35 years old, tall, athletic, and impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit that made Bradley's expensive but wrinkled outfit look entirely inadequate. As an African-American man married to Bradley's younger sister Megan, Jamal had spent the last 7 years enduring the relentless, thinly veiled racism and classist microaggressions of this insufferable family. Despite holding a master's degree in cybersecurity from MIT, Patricia still treated him like the household handyman, asking him to fix her wireless router or set up her printer at every single Thanksgiving dinner. Bradley consistently introduced Jamal to his corporate friends as Megan's husband, who works in IT, deliberately minimizing Jamal's actual career to make himself look superior. Jamal had absorbed their blatant disrespect in silence for years, knowing perfectly well that his intellect, his character, and his net worth vastly overshadowed theirs. Patricia immediately redirected her furious panic toward the newest arrival, eager to reassert her dominance over someone she deemed inferior. "What are you doing here?" she screamed, her face twisting with ugly, naked contempt. "This is a private family crisis. Who let you in? We do not need the help standing around eavesdropping on our finances. Get out of my son's house immediately before I call the police for trespassing." Jamal did not flinch. He did not break his stride. He did not even look at Patricia. He walked right past her, treating her with the exact same absolute dismissive silence that Leo had shown Bradley the night before. He bypassed Spencer, who instinctively shrank back from Jamal's commanding, unbothered presence, and walked straight toward me at the kitchen island. "Good morning, Diana," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice easily cutting through the chaotic, high-pitched screaming of my in-laws. "Megan sends her love." She decided to stay in the car. She said she could not stomach looking at her mother or her brother today. I offered Jamal a genuine, relaxed smile, the very first expression of actual warmth I had shown all morning. Jamal had always been the only person in this toxic family who treated me with actual respect. We had quietly bonded over being the outsiders, the ones sitting in the corner observing the absolute absurdity of the people who genuinely believed they were superior to us. Bradley lunged forward, his face red with panic and rage, pointing an aggressive, shaking finger at Jamal. "You have no business being here, Jamal. You work in the IT department of my company. I am a vice president. I will have you fired by noon for trespassing on my property and harassing my family." Jamal finally turned his head, fixing his calm, lethal gaze on my husband. "First of all, Bradley, I do not work in your IT department. I am an independent elite cybersecurity auditor, contracted directly by your board of directors to monitor corporate compliance. I report to the chairman, not to middle management. And second, you do not own this property. We all just heard Diana prove that." Bradley swallowed hard, the remaining color draining from his face as the reality of Jamal's actual job title finally registered in his panicking brain. Jamal turned his attention back to me, his expression turning deadly serious. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. Patricia was still ranting in the background, demanding respect, demanding that someone call security, but her voice faded into meaningless static against the heavy, impending reality of what Jamal was about to do. He had spent the last 48 hours pulling all-nighters utilizing his top-tier security clearance and forensic accounting software to dig deep into the encrypted servers of Bradley's corporation. He had bypassed firewalls and traced hidden digital footprints that Bradley thought were permanently erased. Jamal pulled his hand from his pocket. He held a sleek, heavy, matte black USB drive between his fingers. The small metal device gleamed under the kitchen's bright, recessed lighting. He tossed it onto the marble kitchen island. It landed with a sharp, decisive clack right next to the original property deed and Patricia's designer handbag. The sound made Bradley physically jump as if a gunshot had gone off in the room. "Diana," Jamal said, his voice ringing out with absolute devastating clarity. "I audited Bradley's corporate and personal accounts. I am sorry it took me this long to bring you the proof." I picked up the matte black USB drive. It felt incredibly heavy, loaded with the digital execution of my husband's entire existence. Bradley lunged forward, his hands clawing wildly toward the marble island to snatch the device from my grasp. He did not make it halfway. Jamal stepped smoothly into his path, planting his feet and crossing his arms. Jamal was an athlete who ran marathons on weekends. Bradley spent his weekends drinking scotch and playing golf. When Bradley collided with Jamal's chest, he bounced off like a paperweight hitting a brick wall. "Get out of my way!" Bradley shrieked, his voice cracking with pure terror. "That is stolen corporate property. You are going to federal prison, Jamal. I will press charges." Jamal stared down at him with zero emotion. "I am a federally licensed auditor, Bradley. I have full authorization to pull these files. The only person facing federal charges today is you." I turned my back on the pathetic scuffle and walked out of the kitchen, taking deliberate, measured steps toward our sprawling living room. The massive 85-inch smart TV dominated the far wall. Patricia and Spencer scrambled after me, their previous anger entirely eclipsed by morbid, greedy curiosity. They still believed Bradley was a financial genius who had simply made a minor mistake. They wanted to see the numbers. They wanted to know exactly how much wealth they could squeeze out of him once this blew over. I plugged the USB drive directly into the port on the side of the television screen. I grabbed the remote and navigated to the external input. The screen flashed black for a fraction of a second before mirroring the contents of the drive. The resolution was crystal clear. Dozens of meticulously organized folders populated the screen. Jamal had categorized everything with ruthless efficiency. I clicked on the folder labeled Hidden Liabilities and Offshore Transfers. A sprawling spreadsheet opened filled with highlighted rows of wire transfers routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Delaware LLCs. Patricia leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "What is all this?" she demanded. "These are just business expenses. My son manages high-level corporate assets." "These are not corporate assets," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the quiet living room. "Look at the source accounts, Patricia." I highlighted a specific column. The routing numbers matched our joint savings accounts, the accounts where I had deposited my own modest income to maintain my cover alongside the money Bradley claimed he was saving for our future. "He has been systematically siphoning money from our joint assets for over 2 years," I explained, keeping my tone entirely clinical. "He routed the funds through dummy corporations to hide them from me and from the Internal Revenue Service. He is drowning in millions of dollars of hidden debt, taking out high-interest loans to cover the deficits he created when his bad stock picks crashed." Bradley was hyperventilating in the hallway, trying to push past Jamal, but completely failing to move the taller man. "Shut it off," Bradley begged, his voice dissolving into a pathetic whine. "Diana, please shut it off. We can handle this privately. Do not do this in front of them." I ignored him completely. I exited the spreadsheet and opened the next folder, simply titled Real Estate Holdings. A high-resolution scan of a property deed appeared on the massive screen. It detailed a penthouse apartment located in one of the most exclusive, expensive high-rise buildings in downtown Chicago. Patricia gasped, clapping her hands together. Her face instantly transformed from panic to pure, unfiltered greed. "Oh, Bradley, you brilliant boy!" she exclaimed, pointing triumphantly at the screen. "I knew it. You were making secret real estate investments. You bought a luxury condo downtown to flip for a profit. You see, Diana, he is a financial genius. He was trying to build a real portfolio while you were planting daisies." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It was the first time I had laughed all morning, and the sound made Patricia flinch. "You really are incredibly blind, Patricia," I said, turning to look her directly in the eyes. "Read the secondary name on the deed. It is right there under your brilliant son's name." Spencer stepped closer to the screen, his eyes scanning the legal document. He squinted at the fine print. "Who is Vanessa Spencer?" asked, completely oblivious to the bomb he was about to detonate. Bradley let out a wounded, suffocating noise from the hallway. "Vanessa is not a real estate partner," I stated, staring dead at Bradley. "Vanessa is a 24-year-old fitness instructor. She is his mistress." Patricia froze. Her hand hovered in the air, pointing at the screen, her mouth hanging wide open in utter shock. I clicked on a subfolder containing bank statements and credit card receipts. The screen filled with undeniable evidence. Bradley has been funding a fully paid luxury lifestyle for his mistress for exactly 2 years. He used the money he stole from our joint accounts to pay her rent, buy her a sports car, and take her on luxury vacations to the Bahamas while telling me he was away on corporate retreats. That condo is not an investment property. It is a fully funded love nest. He drained his own equity, took out a secret second mortgage on this house, and committed corporate fraud, all to impress a girl 12 years younger than him. The silence in the living room was absolute. Patricia looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her perfect, successful vice president's son was not just broke. He was a lying, cheating, embezzling fraud who had squandered their family reputation on a secret double life. Bradley finally snapped. The sheer terror of having his carefully constructed, arrogant facade completely annihilated sent him into a feral, desperate panic. He ducked under Jamal's arm, scrambling wildly into the living room. He did not care about his tailored suit or his dignity. He sprinted toward the television, his hands outstretched, desperate to rip the USB drive out of the socket and destroy the evidence. "You cannot do this to me!" Bradley shrieked, his shoes slipping wildly on the polished hardwood floor. "I will not let you ruin my life." He lunged at the screen, his fingers clawing frantically at the side panel to find the small metal drive. But in his blind panic, his hand slammed against the television frame, knocking the remote control off the media console. The remote hit the ground, the impact inadvertently pressing the play button. Bradley grabbed the USB drive, ripping it out of the port with a violent jerk. He stood there panting, clutching the device to his chest, a manic, triumphant grin spreading across his sweating face. But the damage was already done. The media player on the smart television had already buffered the next file in the queue. As Bradley stood there clutching the disconnected drive, the massive surround sound speakers of our living room crackled to life. An audio file began to autoplay, broadcasting at maximum volume. It was a recorded phone call. The sound was incredibly crisp, captured directly from Bradley's corporate cell phone data cache by Jamal's expert auditing software. Bradley's voice filled the room, sounding relaxed, arrogant, and viciously cruel. He was speaking to his mistress, Vanessa. "I know, babe, I know." The recorded version of Bradley laughed. "I will be at the condo as soon as I can. I just have to deal with my mother first. She is constantly begging me for cash. Honestly, she is nothing but a gold-digging old bat who thinks my bank account is her personal lottery ticket. I am so sick of pretending to respect her." Patricia let out a horrifying strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. The color entirely drained from her face. "And my brother is even worse," the recording of Bradley continued, his voice dripping with pure disgust. "Spencer is a completely useless leech. He sits around in his expensive tracksuits pretending to be an influencer while draining my wallet. The second this merger goes through and I get my executive bonus, I am cutting them both off permanently. They are pathetic parasites and I am done dragging them around." Bradley stood frozen in front of the television, the disconnected USB drive slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor. The echo of the recording faded into a suffocating, heavy silence. Bradley stood frozen in front of the television, the disconnected USB drive slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering onto the floor. The sharp sound of the metal hitting the hardwood seemed to break the spell that held the room hostage. Patricia took a slow, shuddering step forward. Her pristine suburban facade completely shattered, leaving behind a hollow, devastated older woman. The son she worshipped, the man she praised to every single member of her country club, had just called her a gold-digging bat. She raised her hand, her diamond rings catching the ambient light, and struck Bradley across the face with everything she had. The slap sounded like a whip cracking through the large living room. Bradley stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. "How dare you, Patricia?" hissed her voice, trembling with a level of venom I had never heard her use. "I gave you everything. I defended you. I bragged about you to everyone we know, and you call me a parasite while you spend millions on some gym instructor." Before Bradley could even formulate a pathetic excuse, Spencer lunged. The insult about being a useless leech had struck a nerve deep within his fragile, unearned ego. Spencer tackled his older brother around the waist, driving his shoulder directly into Bradley's chest. The two grown men crashed backward into my custom glass coffee table, shattering the surface into 1,000 glittering pieces. It was a pathetic, chaotic brawl. Designer suits tore and fists flew wildly. Spencer threw sloppy, uncoordinated punches, screaming about his ruined gaming career and the money Bradley owed him. Bradley fought back with frantic, desperate shoves, trying to protect his face while slipping on the polished wood floor. Blood from a cut on Bradley's lips smeared across his crisp white collar. They were no longer the arrogant, superior men of the household. They were feral animals tearing each other apart over the scraps of their destroyed pride. I did not move. I simply watched the empire of lies burn itself to the ground. Jamal stepped smoothly in front of me, using his broad shoulders to shield me from the flying glass and flailing limbs. He did not raise his fists. He did not need to. He possessed an inherent commanding authority that required zero physical violence. Enough, Jamal's voice boomed through the room. It was not a yell. It was a command delivered with the absolute power of a man who had finally lost his patience. Both brothers froze, panting heavily, tangled together among the ruined furniture. Patricia sobbed into her hands, her carefully styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. Jamal looked down at the three of them with pure, unfiltered disgust. "You people are unbelievable," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal cadence. "For 7 years, my wife and I have sat at your family dinners. I watched you turn up your noses at my skin color, my background, and my supposed IT job. You treated Diana like a peasant because she preferred soil to your fake designer bags. You built this entire pathetic suburban illusion on the idea that you were genetically and financially superior to everyone else." Jamal stepped closer to Patricia, who flinched away from him. "And look at you now," he continued, his tone merciless. "You are nothing but hypocrites. Patricia, you worshipped a son who was actively stealing from his own marriage to fund a mistress. Spencer, you demand executive salaries while having zero skills, expecting the world to hand you a crown just for existing. And Bradley." Jamal shifted his gaze to my bleeding, gasping husband. "You are the biggest fraud of them all. You embezzled from your company, you stole from your wife, and you sold out your own blood just to feel like a big man in a downtown condo. The only real people in this room are the ones you deemed beneath you." I stepped out from behind Jamal, feeling a profound, absolute sense of liberation. The pristine living room I had meticulously decorated was trashed, but I had never felt cleaner. I looked down at Bradley, who was currently attempting to wipe the blood from his mouth with the back of his torn suit sleeve. "Get out," I said. My voice was completely calm, carrying no anger, no sorrow, just finality. Bradley blinked up at me, spitting blood onto the ruined floorboards. "Diana, please," he rasped. "I said get out," I repeated, stepping closer. "All of you, get out of my house. Patricia, take your golden child and your leech of a youngest son and get off my property. You have exactly 5 minutes before I trigger the panic alarm and have the police remove you for trespassing and vandalism." Patricia scrambled to her feet, grabbing her designer bag with shaking hands. She did not look at me. She did not look at Bradley. She practically sprinted for the front door, leaving her precious sons behind to save her own skin. Spencer scrambled up right after her, nursing a bruised eye, completely abandoning his brother without a second thought. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them. Bradley remained on the floor. He slowly pushed himself up to his feet, swaying slightly as he took in the reality of his situation. His mother had abandoned him. His brother hated him. His career was imploding, and his secret life was entirely exposed. He was backed into a corner, a desperate rat with nowhere left to run. And just like a rat, he bared his teeth. The pathetic, pleading expression vanished from Bradley's face. His eyes went dark, feral, and consumed by a terrifying, unhinged greed. He wiped the blood from his chin, staining his hand, and let out a broken, manic laugh. "Fine," Bradley screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. "Fine, I will leave. You think you have won, Diana? You think you can just kick me out and walk away back to your billionaire brother and your massive venture capital firm? You are forgetting one crucial detail." He took a staggering step toward me, his chest heaving, his face twisting into a mask of pure vindictive malice. "This is a 50-50 state," Bradley roared, pointing a bloody finger directly at my face. "We are married. I do not care how many secret businesses you started or how much money you funneled into Apex AI. What is yours is mine. I am calling the most ruthless divorce lawyers in this city. I am taking half of your secret Vanguard Holdings wealth in the divorce. I will take half your billions, Diana. You will pay me for the rest of your life. Bradley stood amidst the shattered glass of our living room, his chest heaving as his threat echoed off the walls. He did not retreat. He did not run to pack his bags. Instead, driven by the intoxicating delusion of unearned wealth, he pulled his phone from his ruined suit pocket. His hands were shaking, smearing blood on the cracked screen, but his eyes were locked on me with a manic, greedy intensity. He paced the floor, barking harsh orders into the receiver, demanding that his attorney drop everything and come to the house immediately. He wanted to strike while the iron was hot, absolutely convinced he had just discovered the ultimate winning lottery ticket. Jamal stepped forward, offering to physically throw him out, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Let him stay," I said smoothly. "Let him summon his attack dog. I want to watch this play out." It took less than 40 minutes for Bradley's legal muscle to arrive. A sleek silver sports car pulled aggressively into my driveway, tires screeching against the pavement. The man who stepped out was the absolute epitome of predatory corporate law. He wore a pinstripe suit that cost more than my first car and carried a monogrammed leather briefcase. He walked through my front door without bothering to knock, taking in the blood, the shattered coffee table, and the general chaos of the room with an amused, cynical smirk. This was Preston Cole, a notorious divorce attorney in the city known for bleeding spouses dry and leaving them with nothing but legal fees and regret. Bradley had apparently been keeping him on retainer for months, likely preparing to divorce me and leave me penniless the moment his corporate merger with Apex AI went through. Now, the expensive weapon he had bought to destroy my life was being repurposed to steal my empire. Preston stepped carefully over the broken glass and stood next to my husband. He did not introduce himself to me. He did not acknowledge Jamal, who stood silently observing the spectacle. Preston simply opened his briefcase, pulled out a yellow legal pad, and looked at me as if I were a highly lucrative piece of meat. "Well," Diana Preston began, his voice dripping with heavy condescension, "my client has just informed me of a rather fascinating development. It appears you have been acting in terrible faith for the entirety of this marriage, hiding massive streams of revenue operating shell companies and concealing a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm from your legal spouse. That is the textbook definition of financial deception." Bradley stood taller, his bruised face stretching into a triumphant sneer. He wiped his bloody chin with a handkerchief, clearly emboldened by his lawyer's aggressive presence. "Tell her exactly how this works, Preston. Tell her what she owes me." Preston chuckled, pacing slowly across my ruined living room. "The law in this state is beautifully straightforward, Diana. Marital assets are marital assets regardless of whose name is on the holding company. You thought you were so incredibly clever playing the submissive, quiet little plant shop owner while building a shadow empire behind my client's back. But the reality is every single dollar you earned, every share you acquired, and every investment you made during the tenure of this marriage belongs equally to Bradley." He paused, letting his threat sink in, clearly expecting me to break down in tears. When I did not react, he pushed harder, his tone turning vicious. "We are going to subpoena every record Vanguard Holdings possesses. We will audit your brother's company Apex AI to determine the exact valuation of your initial seed funding. We are going to drag your entire secretive financial network into the glaring light of open court. By the time I am finished dismantling your corporate structure, Bradley will own half of your shares, half of your voting rights, and half of your liquid capital. You will be paying him millions of dollars a year in alimony just to maintain his standard of living." Bradley laughed out loud, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You hear that? I am going to take your brother's company right out from under you. You ruined my career tonight, so I am taking yours. I will be sitting on your board of directors by next month." I did not shout. I did not argue the law. I simply turned my back on the two gloating men and walked straight into the kitchen. I approached the espresso machine. The beans ground loudly, completely drowning out Preston's ongoing monologue about asset division and forensic accounting. I steamed the milk, pouring it carefully into my mug. Jamal leaned against the kitchen counter, watching me with a quiet, knowing smile. He knew I never engaged in a battle unless I had already secured the victory. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The rich, warm flavor was an absolute delight. I walked back toward the living room, holding the mug in one hand, projecting an aura of total, unbothered calm. Preston frowned, clearly irritated that his aggressive intimidation tactics were bouncing off me like rain on titanium. "Are you even listening to me?" He snapped, his professional veneer cracking. "You are facing absolute financial ruin. You are about to lose half of $1 billion empire. You should be calling your own legal counsel to negotiate a settlement before I freeze every single account attached to your name." I took another sip of my coffee, savoring the silence that followed his outburst. I walked past Preston. I walked past Bradley. I headed straight for the hallway, stepping directly toward the framed botanical print that concealed my wall safe. I punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy steel door clicked open. Preston watched me, crossing his arms. "Running to your safe will not help you hide anything, Diana. My forensic team will find every document, every gold bar, and every offshore routing number you possess." I ignored him. I reached past the stacks of property deeds and corporate seals. From the very bottom of the safe, I pulled out a single faded manila folder. It was not a thick document. It was just a few pages of heavy bond paper signed and notarized half a decade ago. I walked back to the living room and tossed the manila folder onto the one unbroken side table left in the space. "Before we talk about my assets," I said, my voice cutting through the room with surgical precision, "let's talk about the contract Bradley forced me to sign 5 years ago." "Before we talk about my assets," I said, my voice cutting through the room with surgical precision, "let's talk about the contract Bradley forced me to sign 5 years ago." Bradley scoffed, his bruised face contorting into a mask of pure, frantic confusion. "A contract? What contract?" He looked wildly at Preston, silently demanding his expensive attack dog do his job and vaporize this new obstacle. Preston did not immediately respond. He approached the unbroken side table with the extreme caution of a bomb disposal expert. He flipped open the faded manila cover. The crisp, dense legal text inside was unmistakable. It was a prenuptial agreement, bound with heavy blue backing paper and bearing the embossed seal of a prominent local notary. I walked slowly around the shattered glass of the coffee table, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. 5 years ago, I explained, keeping my gaze locked on my husband. Bradley was a newly promoted regional manager. He had just received a minor bump in his salary and a modest stock option package. He was absolutely terrified that his new wealth would be drained by a woman who played with dirt all day. He told his mother I was a financial liability. He thought I was going to anchor him down and steal his hard-earned corporate bonuses. Bradley's eyes darted back and forth. "I did not make you sign that. My mother suggested it. It was just a standard precaution to protect my retirement accounts." "It was a brilliantly drafted execution warrant," I corrected him. "You hired an incredibly aggressive legal team to construct it. You wanted to make absolutely certain that if our marriage failed, I could never touch a single dime of your money." Preston was reading the document silently, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs with increasing speed. His cynical smirk was completely gone. His jaw tightened, and a slight frown creased his forehead. "Read it aloud, Preston," I commanded. "Read the asset division parameters so your client understands exactly where he stands." The ruthless divorce attorney cleared his throat, his professional detachment faltering for the first time since he swaggered through my front door. Section 4. Paragraph 2. Preston read, his voice flat and mechanical. "All assets acquired, developed, founded, or funded by either party during the tenure of the marriage shall remain the sole and exclusive property of the acquiring individual. There shall be no commingling of corporate equity, venture capital, or real estate holdings. What is mine is mine. What is yours is yours." Bradley swallowed hard, the remaining color draining from his face until he looked positively ill. "Wait, that cannot apply to a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. That was just meant to protect my personal savings and my corporate stock options. You cannot use a standard prenup to hide an entire financial empire." Preston did not look up from the pages. "Actually, Bradley," he said, his tone turning remarkably cold, "the language your attorneys used is ironclad. It covers all corporate equity and venture capital without exception. She does not owe you half of Vanguard Holdings. She does not owe you a single penny of her business revenue. By forcing her to sign this, you legally walled yourself off from her entire fortune. You built a fortress to keep her out and locked yourself outside of it. Bradley staggered backward, his shoulders hitting the wall. He dragged his hands through his hair, leaving smears of dried blood on his forehead. No, he gasped, his chest heaving with panic. No. That contract is 5 years old. A judge can throw it out. We can fight it in court. We can say I signed it under duress, or that the financial disparity is too great to be enforced. You could certainly try to litigate it, I said, taking another calm sip of my coffee. But you are forgetting the most important part of the document, Bradley. The part you insisted on adding because you wanted to maintain absolute control over my behavior. You were so convinced I would cheat on you with a landscaper that you demanded a penalty clause. I gestured toward the final pages of the contract resting in Preston's hands. Flip to Section 9, Preston. The moral turpitude clause. Preston turned the page. He read the header and his shoulders visibly slumped. He let out a long, heavy exhale, the sound of a man who just realized he had wasted a very expensive trip across the city. Section 9. Preston read, skipping the heavy legal jargon, to deliver the killing blow. In the event of a divorce initiated due to proven infidelity, adultery, or misappropriation of marital funds for the purpose of maintaining an extramarital affair, the offending party forfeits any and all right to challenge this agreement. The offending party waives all rights to alimony, spousal support, and legal fee reimbursement. They leave the marriage with absolutely zero claims to any assets whatsoever. The silence that engulfed the living room was absolute. Jamal, who had been quietly leaning against the kitchen counter the entire time, let out a low, appreciative whistle. "You dug your own grave, man," Jamal said, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You bought the shovel, paid for the dirt, and jumped right in." Bradley looked completely destroyed. He turned his desperate wide eyes toward the massive smart television screen. The spreadsheet detailing his offshore transfers to his mistress was still glowing brightly. The high-resolution scan of the luxury downtown condo deed, bearing the name of the 24-year-old fitness instructor, was still open in the next window. The audio recording of his voice viciously mocking his mother and brother while planning his next rendezvous was fresh in everyone's memory. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was forensic, undeniable, and currently sitting on the sleek black USB drive resting on the floor. Preston slowly closed the manila folder. He did not toss it back onto the table. He set it down with extreme care as if the document were radioactive. He looked at the prenuptial agreement, then looked up at the television screen displaying the undeniable proof of Bradley's 2-year affair. Finally, he looked at his client. Bradley Preston said, his voice completely devoid of the aggressive, predatory swagger he had walked in with. "You told me over the phone that your wife was hiding assets and that you were the primary breadwinner. You failed to mention that you forced her to sign an ironclad prenup that entirely isolates her wealth. You also failed to mention that you have been embezzling money to fund a mistress, which triggers a zero-tolerance infidelity clause that strips you of every single legal right you might have had to fight this in court." "Preston, please," Bradley begged, holding his hands out in a pathetic gesture of submission. "We can find a loophole. You are the best divorce lawyer in Chicago. You can destroy her in litigation. I will give you 20% of whatever we take. I will give you 30%. Just tear that contract apart." Preston picked up his monogrammed leather briefcase from the floor. He snapped the golden latches shut with a sharp, echoing click. He adjusted his expensive pinstripe suit, smoothing out the wrinkles with clinical precision. "To pay me 30%, you would need to actually win a settlement," Preston said, his tone turning to pure ice. "And to win a settlement, you would need a case. You do not have a case. You have a legally binding contract that you drafted yourself, which explicitly guarantees you walk away with nothing. Furthermore, you have confessed to corporate embezzlement on a recorded audio file." Preston walked past Bradley, heading straight for the front door. He did not look back. He did not offer a polite farewell. "You are a dead man walking," Preston stated, placing his hand on the brass doorknob. "I am not working for free." The heavy oak door slammed shut behind Preston Cole. The sharp sound echoed through the ruined living room like the final gavel strike of a ruthless judge. Bradley stood frozen in the center of the shattered glass, completely abandoned by the one man he thought could save his stolen wealth. The aggressive, predatory lawyer who was supposed to strip me of my empire had taken one look at the unassailable facts and run for the hills. Jamal let out a sharp bark of laughter, shaking his head in pure disbelief as he pushed himself off the kitchen counter. Bradley stared at the empty doorway. His chest heaved wildly under his torn, expensive dress shirt. He looked down at his trembling hands, then up at the massive smart television screen that still displayed the undeniable forensic proof of his infidelity and his corporate embezzlement. The crushing reality of his absolute legal defeat finally crashed down on him. The prenuptial agreement he had forced me to sign to protect his meager savings had just locked him out of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital fortune. But instead of dropping to his knees and surrendering to the consequences of his own actions, his panic mutated into a dark, toxic, and entirely delusional rage. If the law could not help him steal my wealth, he would resort to the only arena where he still believed he held absolute, unquestionable power: the corporate boardroom. Bradley wiped the sweat and smeared blood from his forehead. His posture shifted from a defeated slump to a rigid, aggressive stance. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes burning with frantic malice. "You think this is over, Diana?" he snarled, his voice vibrating with a desperate, unhinged arrogance. "You think a piece of paper and a cowardly lawyer means you have won this war? You are forgetting exactly who I am. I am still the Vice President of Business Development. I hold the keys to the Apex AI merger. That historic deal does not move forward a single inch without my signature and my direct executive approval." I watched him, my expression completely flat. He was grasping at straws, trying to forge a deadly weapon out of nothing but smoke and mirrors. Bradley paced across the room, his leather shoes crunching loudly on the broken glass of our coffee table. "Mr. Montgomery relies entirely on my risk analysis," Bradley boasted, puffing out his chest and projecting his voice as if he were commanding a room full of subordinates. "I am the absolute gatekeeper of all tech acquisitions at our firm. If I walk into that corner office tomorrow morning and tell Montgomery that Apex AI is a massive financial liability, the deal is completely dead." Jamal crossed his arms, looking at Bradley with sheer, unfiltered pity. "You are talking about committing blatant corporate sabotage just to spite your wife," Jamal said, his deep voice cutting through the manic rant. "You are talking about intentionally tanking a deal that your boss desperately needs." "I am talking about absolute destruction!" Bradley roared, ignoring Jamal completely. He took an aggressive step closer to me, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. "I know how the game is played, Diana. I will tell the executive board that your brother's artificial intelligence algorithms are fundamentally flawed. I will fabricate severe compliance violations and plant them in the audit files. I will leak fake internal memos to the tech press claiming Apex AI is built on stolen intellectual property. By the time I am done planting evidence, the Securities and Exchange Commission will be knocking on Leo's front door." I took a slow, measured sip of my espresso. Bradley was hyperventilating now, completely intoxicated by his own delusions of grandeur. He truly thought he was a corporate titan, capable of moving mountains. He thought I was just a silent investor who did not understand the ruthless politics of a corporate buyout. "Mr. Montgomery has deep connections with every major venture capital firm in the country." Bradley continued, a manic glint shining in his bloodshot eyes. "He plays golf with the board members of Silicon Valley's biggest tech conglomerates. And let me remind you, Diana, he was absolutely furious at your arrogant brother last night at the restaurant. Montgomery felt disrespected. He felt publicly humiliated. He is already looking for a reason to crush Leo. When I bring him this fabricated risk assessment, he will enthusiastically help me burn Apex AI to the ground." Bradley spread his arms wide, gesturing to the ruined living room as if he had just conquered a battlefield. "I will make sure Leo's company is blacklisted across the entire global tech sector. I will make his proprietary software absolutely worthless. You wanted to protect your little empire, Diana. You wanted to hide your billions from me and humiliate me in front of my boss. Well, congratulations. You get to keep your hidden money, but I am going to make sure your precious younger brother loses everything. And when his company tanks, Vanguard Holdings will take a massive financial hit. I will ensure your investment portfolio bleeds out on the trading floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or offer a single word of protest. I simply looked at the pathetic, bleeding man standing in my wrecked house and let him scream his empty threats into the void. My total lack of fear seemed to enrage him even further. Bradley spun around, snatching his ruined suit jacket from the back of the sofa. He marched toward the front door, his shoes leaving bloody wet tracks across the pristine hardwood floor. "You are going to deeply regret the day you ever crossed me," Bradley screamed, tearing the heavy front door open and stepping out onto the porch. "I am going to destroy your brother. I am going to destroy everything you built. You will be on your knees begging me to stop by tomorrow afternoon." He slammed the door with enough violent force to rattle the expensive picture frames hanging on the walls. Seconds later, the aggressive roar of his sports car engine echoed through the driveway, followed by the sharp screech of tires as he sped away, racing off to plot his imaginary corporate vengeance. The house fell silent, leaving only the soft hum of the television screen displaying his financial crimes. Jamal let out a long breath, stepping carefully over the broken glass to stand beside me. "The man is completely unhinged," Jamal said, shaking his head. "He actually believes he has the power to sink a unicorn tech company. He thinks Montgomery is going to back him up after the absolute disaster at the restaurant last night. He does not even realize his career is already over based on the embezzlement files on that drive." I placed my empty coffee mug on the kitchen counter. "Bradley has always believed his own lies," I said calmly. "He is going to walk into that corporate skyscraper tomorrow morning expecting to be a kingmaker." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my calm, unbothered face. I scrolled to a specific, highly encrypted contact, bypassing all usual corporate channels, and pressed the call button. The line rang exactly once before it was answered. "Leo." I said, my voice dropping to a cool, lethal cadence that signaled the absolute end of my husband's professional existence. "It is time to trigger the acquisition." Through the encrypted security feeds and audio taps Jamal had actively embedded in Bradley's corporate devices, I had a front-row seat to his final morning of absolute delusion. Bradley woke up in the downtown luxury condo he had fraudulently purchased for his mistress. He completely ignored his bruised jaw and the split lip he had sustained from the pathetic fight with his brother the day prior. Instead of realizing his entire life was effectively over, he doubled down on his own toxic narcissism. He put on his most expensive, imported Italian power suit, knotting his silk tie with aggressive, jerky movements. He genuinely believed that a sharp suit, a loud voice, and a ruthless attitude could rewrite reality. The morning sun glared off the towering glass and steel facade of the corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. Bradley strode through the revolving glass doors of the grand atrium like a conquering emperor returning from battle. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floors. He flashed his silver executive badge at the security turnstiles, not even bothering to look the guards in the eye. He rode the private executive elevator up to the 50th floor, adjusting his pristine cuffs and mentally rehearsing his manipulative pitch. He planned to march into the boardroom and tell Mr. Montgomery that the absolute disaster at the restaurant was actually a highly calculated stress test. He was going to brazenly claim that he had purposefully provoked the CEO of Apex AI to expose the volatile, unstable leadership of my brother's company. He actually thought his boss would buy this absurd, fabricated narrative. The moment the elevator doors parted on the executive floor, Bradley's true, deeply toxic nature bled out into the corporate hallways. A young, nervous intern named Kevin was rushing past, carefully balancing a cardboard tray of hot coffees. Bradley intentionally stepped directly into his path, forcing the young man to stop, so abruptly that he stumbled. Hot coffee spilled over the edge of the cups, splashing onto the expensive carpet. Bradley did not apologize or step aside. He leaned in incredibly close to the trembling intern, his face twisting into a mask of pure corporate cruelty. He loudly told Kevin that he was entirely incompetent, a complete waste of company payroll, and that if he ever crossed his path or spilled a single drop of coffee near his office again, he would personally ensure the boy never secured another job in the entire city. Bradley enjoyed the petty power trip. He actively thrived on making those beneath him feel small, terrified, and utterly worthless. Bradley continued his arrogant march down the plushly carpeted corridor, heading straight for the open-plan cubicles of the junior analysts. He stopped abruptly at the desk of a hard-working, dedicated employee named Rebecca. Without greeting her or offering a shred of professional courtesy, he slammed his heavy hand down on her desk, demanding the preliminary risk assessment files for the Apex AI merger immediately. When Rebecca calmly and professionally informed him that those specific files were already uploaded and categorized on the secure executive server as he had previously requested, Bradley exploded. He aggressively berated her in front of the entire open office department. He called her lazy, insubordinate, and entirely replaceable. He loudly declared that he was the absolute only person keeping this department afloat and explicitly threatened to terminate her employment before her lunch break. It was a pathetic, entirely transparent display of a weak, terrified man desperately trying to project ultimate dominance to soothe his own fragile ego. Feeling thoroughly energized by bullying his subordinates, Bradley marched directly to the heavy mahogany desk of Mr. Montgomery's executive secretary. He did not ask for an appointment or check the schedule. He slammed his palms down hard on her pristine leather desk pad and demanded an immediate emergency meeting with the executive board. He puffed out his chest using his loudest, most authoritative voice to declare that he had personally uncovered critical, catastrophic compliance failures regarding the Apex AI acquisition. He arrogantly insisted that the entire financial future of the corporation depended entirely on his immediate intervention and his expert guidance. The secretary did not argue with his aggressive demands. She did not ask him to sit down and wait his turn. She simply looked up at him with a very strange, unreadable expression. It was a potent mixture of deep pity, nervous apprehension, and cold realization. She picked up her telephone receiver, pressed a single glowing button, and quietly announced that Bradley was demanding immediate entry. She nodded once, hung up the receiver, and gestured smoothly toward the massive frosted glass doors of the main boardroom situated at the far end of the hallway. She told him that Mr. Montgomery was already waiting inside for him. Bradley smiled. It was a predatory, deeply arrogant smirk. He adjusted his silk tie one final time, completely convinced that his aggressive intimidation tactics had worked perfectly. He thought the executive board was sitting in that room waiting with bated breath to hear his brilliant fabricated risk analysis. He thought he was about to play the role of the ultimate corporate savior, the vigilant vice president who would bravely rescue the company from a disastrous merger with my brother. He genuinely believed he was about to secure his massive promotion, completely destroy Leo's company, and leverage his new untouchable corporate power to crush me in a brutal divorce court. He strutted down the long hallway, every single step fueled by pure, unadulterated hubris and delusion. He reached out and forcefully pushed open the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, stepping inside, fully expecting to take absolute command of the room. He marched forward, a triumphant, arrogant greeting already forming on his lips, but the words died instantly in his throat. The atmosphere inside the massive room was completely wrong. It was dead silent, freezing cold, and utterly suffocating. Instead of a receptive audience ready to crown him the hero of the corporation, he found Mr. Montgomery sitting rigidly at the head of the massive oak conference table. The senior executive looked physically ill. Mr. Montgomery was sweating profusely, his face pale and slick with heavy moisture, his expensive silk tie loosened drastically around his neck. And he was not sitting alone. Flanking the terrified executive were 6 elite corporate lawyers, men and women wearing immaculate shark gray suits, their faces carved from solid stone. They were not looking at Bradley with respect or eager anticipation. They were looking at him like a man who was already standing on the gallows with the rope pulled tight. Bradley refused to read the terrifying atmosphere of the room. His monumental arrogance acted as a thick blindfold. He looked at the 6 stone-faced corporate attorneys flanking his boss, and immediately assumed they were there to execute his brilliant sabotage strategy. He firmly believed Mr. Montgomery had assembled the legal strike team to preemptively block the Apex AI merger and prepare for a massive corporate lawsuit. Bradley puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the fact that his superior was sweating through a custom-tailored shirt. He marched to the center of the long oak table and slammed his leather portfolio down with a sharp, aggressive thud. Mr. Montgomery Bradley began, his voice echoing with unearned confidence. I am glad you brought the legal team. I have spent the entire night compiling catastrophic risk assessments regarding the Apex AI acquisition. Their proprietary algorithms are a complete fabrication. We have zero legal obligation to proceed. I have uncovered massive compliance violations that give us the perfect leverage to tear up the term sheet and blacklist them across the sector. He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished wood, grinning like a predatory shark. With my guidance, we can completely absorb their market share once the Securities and Exchange Commission dismantles their operation. I just need your authorization to leak these preliminary findings to the tech press by noon. Mr. Montgomery did not smile back. He did not praise his ambitious vice president. The senior executive looked like he was on the verge of a massive cardiac event. He squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving as he fought for air. He slowly raised a violently shaking hand, gesturing for Bradley to stop talking immediately. Bradley, completely oblivious to his own impending doom, misinterpreted the gesture. He thought his boss was simply overwhelmed by the sheer brilliance of the strategy. I know it is a bold move, Sir. Bradley continued, his volume rising as he paced beside the table. But this is how we win. This is how we crush the competition and secure our legacy. Shut your mouth! Mr. Montgomery wheezed, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of absolute terror. He opened his eyes, staring at Bradley with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. I said, shut your mouth, you incompetent fool! You have absolutely no idea what you have done. Bradley froze, his triumphant grin slowly sliding off his bruised face. Sir, I am trying to save this corporation, he stammered, deeply confused by the sudden hostility. I am trying to protect our assets. Before Bradley could utter another pathetic, delusional syllable, the heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the expansive boardroom unlatched with a loud, definitive click. Every single head in the room turned. The 6 elite corporate attorneys immediately stood up from their chairs, adjusting their jackets and standing at absolute rigid attention. Mr. Montgomery gripped the edge of the oak table, using it to leverage his trembling body upright. Bradley stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared at the entrance. The doors swung wide open. The sharp, authoritative click of stiletto heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of Bradley's professional life. I walked into the boardroom. The plain, quiet, submissive wife who wore cheap wrap dresses and clipped coupons was completely gone. I wore a razor-sharp, bespoke, midnight black power suit that projected lethal, untouchable authority. My posture was flawless. My gaze was completely devoid of mercy. I did not look like a woman who played with dirt in a small suburban plant shop. I looked like the apex predator of the global financial ecosystem. I looked exactly like the woman who owned the ground they were all standing on. I did not walk alone. Leo stepped through the mahogany doors exactly 1 pace behind my right shoulder. The brilliant, untouchable tech billionaire who had commanded the absolute reverence of the entire restaurant the night prior was now actively displaying total, unwavering subordination. He carried no arrogance. He simply operated as my loyal second-in-command, his sharp eyes scanning the room to ensure my path was clear. Walking parallel to Leo on my left side was Jamal. My brilliant brother-in-law looked immaculate in a dark, tailored suit of his own. He carried a heavy, locked metallic briefcase containing the digital execution of my husband's entire miserable existence. Jamal looked entirely unbothered, moving with the quiet, lethal confidence of a man who held all the winning cards in his hand. The 3 of us marched down the length of the massive boardroom. The synchronized rhythm of our footsteps sounded like a military procession. The corporate lawyers parted instantly, stepping back to give us a wide, unobstructed path toward the head of the table. Bradley's brain completely short-circuited. The sight of his abused, underestimated wife leading a billionaire CEO and his despised brother-in-law into his highly restricted corporate sanctuary broke his fragile mind. He could not process the overwhelming display of power, his reality fractured entirely. "What is this?" Bradley shrieked, his voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged frequency. "What the hell is she doing here?" He spun around to face Mr. Montgomery, waving his arms frantically toward me. "Sir, you have to call security immediately. This is my crazy, psychotic wife. She is having a mental breakdown, and that guy with the briefcase is just a low-level IT worker. They are trespassing in a restricted corporate zone. Get them out of here before they compromise the data servers. Call the police. Have them arrested." Bradley lunged toward the table intercom, desperately reaching for the security button. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with wild, feral panic. "I will handle this, sir," Bradley yelled, spittle flying from his lips. "I will have them thrown out on the street." Mr. Montgomery did not reach for the security button. He did not look at Bradley. He did not acknowledge the frantic, screaming vice president standing right in front of him. The senior executive swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat rolling down his pale temple. As I approached the head of the long oak table, Mr. Montgomery stepped completely away from his massive high-backed leather chair. The ultimate seat of power in the room, the throne Bradley had spent his entire pathetic career fighting to earn, was now empty. Mr. Montgomery bowed his head in deep, silent reverence. He extended his trembling hand, gesturing respectfully toward the empty center chair, offering his absolute seat of power directly to me. I did not hesitate. I moved with the fluid grace of someone entirely accustomed to wielding absolute power. I stepped past Bradley, who was currently frozen in a grotesque posture of mid-panic, and approached the head of the long oak table. The leather chair was warm from Mr. Montgomery, but the icy authority I brought to the space instantly chilled the room. I sat down. I arranged my posture perfectly, resting my forearms against the polished mahogany edge. Leo took his position standing at my right shoulder, while Jamal stood firmly on my left, placing his heavy metallic briefcase squarely on the table. Bradley stared at Mr. Montgomery, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked like a man watching gravity suddenly reverse itself. He frantically searched his boss's face for any sign of a joke, a hidden camera, or a sudden medical emergency. Sir Bradley choked out his voice, barely a whisper. "Sir, what are you doing? Why are you letting her sit there? Call security. Have her removed." Mr. Montgomery straightened his posture, though his hands remained firmly clasped together to hide their violent shaking. He refused to make eye contact with his former favorite vice president. Instead, he addressed the entire room of elite corporate attorneys and the terrified man standing in the center of the floor. "Bradley, close your mouth and listen very carefully," Mr. Montgomery said, his voice stripped of all warmth and replaced with sheer survival instinct. "You are completely out of your depth. Allow me to formally introduce you to the woman sitting in my chair. Bradley, meet the founder and chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings." Bradley recoiled as if he had been physically struck in the chest. "No, no, that is impossible. Vanguard is a faceless private equity trust. She is my wife. She runs a dirt shop. She sells potted ferns." As of 8 a.m. this morning, Mr. Montgomery continued raising his voice to overpower Bradley's pathetic, frantic denial. Vanguard Holdings executed a hostile takeover. They have officially acquired a 51% controlling stake in this corporation. The board of directors held an emergency vote at dawn. The transaction has cleared. The transition of power is absolute and irreversible. The realization hit Bradley with the devastating force of a freight train. The heavy corporate jargon finally penetrated his thick skull. 51%, controlling stake, Vanguard Holdings. The fragmented pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in his mind. Leo calling her big sister at the restaurant was not just a term of familial endearment. It was a strict hierarchy of absolute power. She did not just give Leo a small family loan. She orchestrated the entire tech ecosystem from the shadows. She was the whale. She was the apex predator of the venture capital world. She owned the private equity firm that owned Apex AI, and now she owned the very skyscraper he stood in. Bradley's eyes darted around the room, tracking the faces of the 6 elite lawyers. He desperately sought a single sympathetic glance, a single ally who would tell him this was a nightmare from which he would soon wake. The lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman in a pristine gray suit, slid a thick-bound acquisition summary across the table. It glided over the polished wood and stopped right at Bradley's fingertips. The cover page bore the Vanguard Holdings crest in heavy black ink, and right beneath it, my signature. The same signature he had watched me write on grocery lists and utility bills was now authorizing the purchase of his entire corporate reality. Bradley reached out with a trembling hand. His fingers brushed the heavy cardstock. He stared at my signature. His mind fractured completely. He was not a corporate titan. He was not a mastermind gatekeeper who held the keys to any merger. He was an insignificant, easily replaceable middle manager employed by his own wife. Every paycheck he had ever bragged about, every bonus he had used to secretly fund his downtown love nest, every shred of professional status he wielded like a weapon against me, to make himself feel superior, it all existed entirely at my mercy. I was the architect of his universe, and I was about to tear it all down to the studs. He looked up from this document, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The sheer terror in his gaze was intoxicating. He finally understood the magnitude of his fatal mistake. He had not just ruined his marriage the night before. He had committed professional suicide on an astronomical scale. His knees buckled slightly, but he caught himself against the edge of the conference table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wood to stay upright. Diana Bradley gasped, his voice hollow and broken, stripped of every ounce of the arrogant bravado he had carried into the building. "You bought the company. You bought my company. I bought my company, Bradley." I corrected him, my voice echoing coldly in the silent boardroom. "You just work here. For now." He opened his mouth to beg. I could see the pathetic apologies forming on his lips. He was going to fall to his knees right there in the boardroom, just as he had done in the restaurant, just as he had done in our shattered living room. He was going to plead for his job, for his reputation, and for a shred of the wealth he had so arrogantly assumed he could steal from me in divorce court. He was going to promise to be a better husband, a better man, a loyal employee. I did not give him the satisfaction of speaking. I had not come to this skyscraper to listen to his desperate excuses. I had come to execute a flawless surgical extraction of a corporate parasite. I settled deeper into the chairman's seat. I brought my hands up, resting my elbows on the polished mahogany armrests, and steepled my fingers together. I looked past Bradley's sweating, panicked face, directing my attention entirely to the man standing faithfully at my left side. The room held its collective breath. The corporate lawyers waited in dead silence. Mr. Montgomery wiped his brow with a silk handkerchief. Bradley stared at me in frozen, helpless terror. "Jamal," I said, my voice carrying the absolute, unquestionable authority of a corporate executioner, "please present the findings of your independent audit to the board." Jamal nodded, his expression completely devoid of mercy. He placed his heavy metallic briefcase onto the polished mahogany table and snapped the locks open. He retrieved a sleek laptop and connected a single encrypted cable to the boardroom's main display system. The massive projector screen on the far wall hummed to life. The Vanguard Holdings corporate logo flashed briefly before being replaced by a highly complex, color-coded financial spreadsheet. Bradley swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically across the rows of data. He recognized the account numbers. He recognized the dummy corporations. He recognized the very digital footprints he had paid thousands of dollars to scrub from the company's servers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Jamal began, his deep voice commanding absolute attention. As an independent cybersecurity auditor contracted directly by Vanguard Holdings, I initiated a forensic trace on all executive financial activities within this corporation over the past 36 months. My objective was to identify compliance vulnerabilities prior to our acquisition. What I uncovered was a sophisticated, systematic embezzlement operation engineered exclusively by your Vice President of Business Development, Bradley. Mr. Montgomery turned an alarming shade of pale gray. The 6 corporate attorneys leaned forward, their eyes locked on the screen, ready to dissect the corporate massacre. Jamal pressed a button on his presentation remote. The screen transitioned to a series of intercepted emails, offshore routing numbers, and falsified vendor invoices. Bradley did not just siphon money from his marital accounts to fund a luxury condo for his 24-year-old mistress, Jamal stated clearly, exposing Bradley's domestic failures to the entire room. He actively exploited his executive clearance to bleed this corporation dry. He created phantom vendor accounts. He approved inflated invoices for marketing services that were never actually rendered. He then routed those excess corporate funds through shell companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, ultimately funneling the stolen capital directly into his own secret pockets. Jamal advanced the slide, revealing a web of international wire transfers. Furthermore, Jamal continued his tone, turning clinical and lethal. Bradley accepted aggressive illegal kickbacks from overseas suppliers in exchange for securing our hardware contracts. He demanded a 10% premium on every shipment, which was deposited directly into an untraceable crypto wallet. Bradley gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He opened his mouth to deny the charges, to scream that the data was fabricated, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The evidence was irrefutable. Jamal had pulled the internal communication logs. He had matched the IP addresses. Every single stolen dollar was meticulously traced and accounted for. The total amount of embezzled corporate funds exceeds $4 million, Jamal concluded, stepping back and folding his arms. The documentation has already been compiled into a secure encrypted file. It is ready for immediate transfer to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Montgomery buried his face in his hands, groaning in sheer professional agony. The lead corporate attorney adjusted her glasses, looking at Bradley as if he were a highly infectious disease. She turned to me, nodding slightly, signaling that the legal threshold for catastrophic termination had been vastly exceeded. I stood up from the chairman's seat. I buttoned the jacket of my midnight black power suit, projecting the absolute lethal authority of a corporate executioner. I looked down at the man who had spent 5 years treating me like an unpaid servant, the man who had mocked my background, insulted my family, and attempted to publicly humiliate me at a luxury restaurant just the night before. "Bradley," I said, my voice echoing like ice cracking across a frozen lake, "your employment at this corporation is not suspended. You are not being offered a severance package. You are not being given the opportunity to quietly resign to save your reputation." Bradley fell to his knees. His expensive Italian trousers hit the hardwood floor with a heavy, pathetic thud. "Diana, please," he begged, tears streaming down his bruised and battered face. "Please do not do this. I will pay it all back. I will sell the condo. I will do whatever you want. Please do not send me to prison." I looked down at him with zero pity. As the chairwoman of Vanguard Holdings and the majority shareholder of this corporation, I am officially terminating your employment with cause. You are fired for gross ethical violations, massive corporate fraud, and felony embezzlement. I walked around the table, standing directly over his kneeling, trembling form. You have forfeited all unvested stock options. Your corporate pension is permanently frozen. Your access to this building, its servers, and its personnel is immediately revoked. My legal team is handing Jamal's forensic audit directly to federal prosecutors by noon today. You will be blacklisted across the entire global tech sector. You will never work in a corporate office again. You will face federal indictment, and you will go to federal prison. Bradley sobbed violently, clutching his stomach as if he had been physically disemboweled. He was completely stripped of his arrogant bravado, his fake wealth, and his toxic superiority. He was nothing but a broken, terrified criminal waiting for the authorities to arrive. The man who had demanded I wait by the coat check was now a weeping mess on my corporate floor. I turned my back on him, preparing to ask security to drag him out of my building. But before I could give the order, a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the heavy tension of the boardroom. It was a cell phone ringing. The aggressive generic ringtone echoed loudly. It was coming from Bradley's ruined suit jacket pocket. Bradley flinched. He slowly reached into his pocket with a trembling, blood-stained hand and pulled out his phone. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen, visible to everyone in the room. It was his mother, Patricia. "Answer it," I commanded, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Put it on speaker." Bradley's thumb shook violently as he swiped the screen and tapped the speaker icon. He dropped the phone onto the polished oak table. "Bradley," Patricia screamed. Her voice was not merely frantic, it was a shredded, hysterical shriek of pure, unadulterated terror. The sound blasted through the boardroom speakers, echoing off the glass walls. "Bradley, where are you? You have to come to the house right now." "Mom, what is happening?" Bradley gasped, his voice cracking. "The bank!" Patricia sobbed, her words tumbling out in a hyperventilating panic. "The bank just showed up with the sheriff's department. They are kicking us out. Spencer is crying in the driveway. Bradley, they are locking the doors and changing the deadbolts. They said the loans you guaranteed went into absolute default. They said you used my house as collateral for your massive business debts, and you stopped paying them months ago. They are officially foreclosing on the property today. We are losing everything. My friends from the country club are driving by and staring at us. We are being thrown out on the street." Patricia's hysterical screams continued to echo from the speaker of the phone, resting on the mahogany table. She wailed about the neighbors watching her humiliation, about the moving trucks pulling into the driveway, and about the sheer, undeniable reality of her sudden poverty. Bradley stared at the device with blank, terrified eyes. His brain had completely shut down. The fortress of arrogance he had built over a lifetime was reduced to ashes in less than 24 hours. I reached forward and tapped the red button on the screen. The call disconnected, plunging the massive boardroom back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I turned my gaze to Mr. Montgomery and the 6 corporate attorneys. I gave them a single dismissive nod. "That is all for now, gentlemen. Please vacate the room." The elite legal team scrambled to comply. They packed their briefcases with frantic speed, eager to escape the blast radius of Bradley's ruined life. Mr. Montgomery practically sprinted toward the mahogany double doors, not casting a single backward glance at the vice president he had once groomed for leadership. Leo offered me a respectful nod before stepping out into the hallway to coordinate with the executive transition team. The heavy doors clicked shut, sealing the room. The boardroom was empty, save for myself, Jamal, and the broken, weeping man kneeling on the floor. Bradley was a pathetic sight. The knees of his custom-tailored Italian trousers were scuffed and dirty. His expensive silk tie hung loosely around his neck, stained with the blood from his split lip. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with desperate, cowardly tears. The terrifying realization that his mother was currently being evicted because of his own fraudulent financial maneuvers finally broke whatever fragile shred of sanity he had left. He collapsed forward, pressing his palms flat against the hardwood floor, and began to sob uncontrollably. It was a loud, wet, gasping sound. He was entirely stripped of his corporate armor, reduced to a groveling, terrified mess. "Diana, please!" Bradley choked out, his voice cracking violently. "You have to understand the pressure I was under. You have to know how incredibly hard it is to maintain this level of corporate success. The stress was eating me alive. I was working 80-hour weeks trying to secure our future. The expectations were crushing me. I made mistakes. I know I made terrible financial mistakes, but I was just trying to cope with the absolute overwhelming anxiety of my position." He crawled a few inches forward, his bloody hands reaching out to hover just inches from my black leather pumps. He did not dare touch me. "Vanessa meant absolutely nothing to me," Bradley pleaded, crying harder as he tried to spin his 2-year affair into a tragic symptom of workplace burnout. "She was just a distraction, a meaningless, stupid distraction from the relentless pressure of this company. And the money, Diana, the corporate funds I took, I was going to invest them and pay everything back. I swear I was. I just wanted to build a massive safety net for us. I wanted to give you the luxurious life you deserved. Please, you have to believe I never wanted to hurt you. Give me a second chance. I will go to rehab. I will go to therapy. I will do anything you demand. Just please do not destroy me." I looked down at him with zero pity. My expression was carved from solid ice. I did not feel a single ounce of compassion for the weeping man at my feet. "Do not dare blame your malicious, calculated cruelty on corporate stress," I said, my voice echoing sharply in the cavernous room. Millions of people experience extreme stress every single day, Bradley. They do not respond by embezzling millions of dollars funding a luxury condo for a 24-year-old fitness instructor and taking out secret mortgages that render their own mothers homeless. You did not steal because you were anxious. You stole because you felt completely entitled. You genuinely believed you were smarter than everyone else in this building. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to look up into my unrelenting gaze. And do not stand there and tell me you wanted to give me a luxurious life. I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, quiet cadence. We both know exactly how much you absolutely thrived on keeping me small. You fed on it. You nourished your fragile, pathetic ego by making sure I always felt financially dependent and socially inferior. I remember your face at the restaurant last night. I remember the exact smirk you wore when you pushed that $4,000 bill across the table, fully expecting my card to decline. I remember how your eyes lit up with vicious joy when you told me to go wait by the coat check like a disobedient dog. Bradley flinched, squeezing his eyes shut as the reality of his own behavior was weaponized against him. You enjoyed humiliating me when you thought I was weak. I stated delivering the absolute truth without a shred of mercy. You loved playing the role of the dominant, successful savior, dragging your pitiful wife out of the gutter. You treated Jamal and Megan like second-class citizens because it made you feel like a king. You did not make a mistake, Bradley. You operated exactly as your true nature dictated. And now you are simply terrified because your victim turned out to be the executioner. Jamal stepped forward from the shadows of the room. He did not say a word. He simply opened his heavy metallic briefcase and retrieved a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. I took the envelope and tossed it onto the center of the polished oak table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud right next to Bradley's abandoned cell phone. Bradley stared at the envelope, his breath hitching in his throat. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his hands gripping the edge of the conference table for support. His eyes darted from the envelope to my face, silently begging for a reprieve that was never going to come. "Sign the divorce papers, Bradley," I commanded, my voice stripping away his final illusion of hope. "I am offering you the fastest, most brutal legal separation in the history of this state. You will surrender all claims to any marital assets. You will accept the infidelity clause of the prenuptial agreement without a single word of protest. You will walk away from this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, which is absolutely nothing." He stared at the documents, his chest heaving. "And if I refuse," he whispered, his voice trembling with terror. "If I ask for my own lawyer to review this first." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table, trapping him in my gaze. "If you hesitate for even a single second," I replied, every syllable dripping with absolute venom, "Jamal transmits the entire corporate embezzlement file to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in exactly 5 minutes. You will leave this skyscraper in handcuffs, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Choose your destiny, Bradley, right now." Bradley stared at the thick manila envelope resting on the polished mahogany table. His breathing was ragged, shallow, and fast. The air in the massive corporate boardroom felt incredibly thin, as if the room itself were rejecting his presence. He looked at Jamal, who stood perfectly still, his hand resting casually over the keyboard of his encrypted laptop. Jamal was not bluffing. The cybersecurity auditor had the direct routing codes to the federal authorities queued up and waiting for a single keystroke. A violent tremor seized Bradley's hands. He slowly reached out, his bloody, bruised fingers grazing the edge of the envelope. He pulled the thick stack of legal documents out of the casing. The bright white pages glared under the recessed boardroom lights. The bold black text at the top of the first page read, "Marital dissolution and complete asset forfeiture agreement." He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the dead silence of the room. He flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs that Preston Cole had tried and failed to circumvent. Every single clause was a nail in his coffin. He was officially admitting to gross financial misconduct within the marriage. He was legally validating the infidelity clause of our prenuptial agreement. He was signing over the deed to the downtown luxury condo, surrendering any claim to the equity in our suburban home, and officially waiving all rights to spousal support, legal fee reimbursement, and future litigation. He was stripping himself down to absolute zero. Diana. Please, Bradley whimpered one last time, a pathetic broken whisper that barely carried across the table. I have nothing left. If I sign this, I am walking out onto the street with the clothes on my back. My mother is losing her house. My career is completely gone. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to live? You will live the exact same way you expected me to live when you threw that credit card across the table last night, I replied, my voice devoid of even a fraction of a degree of warmth. You will figure it out. Or you will not. That is no longer my concern. The clock is ticking, Bradley. Jamal is waiting. A choked, agonizing sob ripped from his throat. The last desperate illusion that he could somehow manipulate his way out of this nightmare completely shattered. He was not a silver-tongued executive anymore. He was a cornered criminal staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Bradley reached for the heavy silver pen resting in the center of the conference table. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel. He hovered the pen over the first signature line. A large tear fell from his cheek, splashing onto the crisp white paper, blurring the black ink of the legal text. He pressed the pen down. He signed his name. The signature was a messy, frantic scrawl, completely lacking the aggressive, arrogant flourish he usually applied to corporate contracts. He flipped to the next page, gasping for air, tears streaming continuously down his face. He signed the asset forfeiture addendum. He signed the property transfer deed for the luxury condo. He initialed every single page acknowledging his infidelity and his complete surrender of all marital rights. The only sounds in the expansive, luxurious boardroom were the scratch of the silver pen against the heavy bond paper and the pathetic, wet sounds of a ruined man weeping over his own destruction. Jamal watched the entire process with cold, clinical detachment, serving as the official witness to the total dismantling of his former brother-in-law. Bradley flipped to the final page. He stared at the last signature line for a long, agonizing moment. This was the final severing of our legal tie. This was the exact moment his status as the husband of a billionaire evaporated into nothing. He let out a low, miserable groan, squeezed his eyes tightly shut, and scrawled his name one last time. He dropped the silver pen. It clattered against the polished oak table, rolling away from him. He pushed the stack of signed documents across the mahogany surface toward me, his head hanging low, his shoulders slumped in absolute catastrophic defeat. He had nothing left to fight with. He was entirely hollowed out, stripped of his wife, his high-paying job, his luxurious house, his stolen money, and his entire professional reputation. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the stack of divorce papers. I pulled them toward me, inspecting each page with deliberate, meticulous care. I checked every signature, every initial, and every date. The execution was flawless. The legal separation was absolute. I tapped the edges of the papers against the table, aligning them perfectly, and slid them back into the manila envelope. I handed the envelope to Jamal. He took it with a respectful nod, securing it safely inside his metallic briefcase, alongside the encrypted corporate audit files. The transaction was officially complete. I stood tall, buttoning the jacket of my midnight black power suit. I looked down at the man kneeling on the floor of the corporate skyscraper he used to believe he ruled. He was still crying, his hands covering his bruised face, his expensive suit ruined and stained. He looked incredibly small. Bradley, I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic sobbing with razor-sharp clarity. He slowly lowered his hands, looking up at me through bloodshot, terrified eyes. He looked like he was bracing for a physical blow. Remember what you told me at the restaurant last night? I asked, holding his gaze with lethal intensity. You looked me right in the eye and told me to leave. You said that the table was strictly for important people. Bradley flinched, fresh tears spilling over his cheeks as the memory of his own staggering arrogance was weaponized against him. You were right, I continued, my tone dropping to a quiet, devastating cadence. It is for important people. But you forgot one crucial thing, Bradley. I own the restaurant too. I did not wait for a response. There was absolutely nothing left for him to say. I turned my back on him, the sharp click of my stiletto heels striking the polished hardwood floor like a final definitive gavel strike. I walked with perfect posture, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who had just conquered an empire and purged a parasite from her life. Jamal fell into step right beside me, carrying the briefcase that held my absolute freedom. We marched toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the far end of the room. I reached out, pushed the heavy glass and wood open, and stepped out into the bustling, brightly lit executive hallway where my new life awaited. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving Bradley entirely alone in the massive, quiet corporate suite. The heavy mahogany double doors sealed shut behind us with a resounding, heavy thud. The sound effectively locked Bradley inside his own personal tomb, severing him completely from the world of power he had so desperately worshipped. I stood in the expansive, sunlit executive lobby, taking a long, deep breath of the crisp, conditioned air. The atmosphere out here was entirely different from the suffocating panic of the boardroom we had just exited. Junior executives and administrative assistants moved briskly across the polished marble floors, carrying sleek tablets and steaming cups of coffee. They were completely oblivious to the absolute corporate massacre that had just occurred mere feet away. I stopped walking and turned to face Jamal. The brilliant cybersecurity auditor stood tall beside me, his grip steady on the metallic briefcase that now held my signed divorce papers and my absolute freedom. His expression remained incredibly professional, but I could see the quiet, profound satisfaction shining in his dark eyes. He had endured years of racial microaggressions, classist insults, and blatant disrespect from my former in-laws. Today, he had struck the definitive blow that brought their fragile, arrogant empire crashing to the ground. "You risked your entire career for me today," I said, my voice dropping to a tone of absolute unwavering sincerity. "You bypassed enterprise-level firewalls. You extracted encrypted executive data. If Bradley had actually possessed a fraction of the corporate power he claimed to hold, he could have buried you in federal litigation. You stood up to his mother and his brother, knowing perfectly well that the fallout might permanently damage your own marriage to Megan. You put yourself directly in the line of fire to protect me." Jamal offered a calm, measured smile. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, projecting an aura of quiet, untouchable dignity. "Bradley was a parasite," Jamal replied, his deep voice echoing with unshakable conviction. "He built his entire fragile ego by stepping on the necks of people he deemed inferior. He looked at my skin color and my job title and decided I was nothing but the household tech support. He looked at your modest dresses and your quiet demeanor and decided you were a helpless victim he could manipulate. I did not just do this for you, Diana. I did this because exposing toxic, arrogant frauds is the exact reason I got into cybersecurity in the first place. You treated me with genuine respect from the moment we met. Bringing you the weapon you needed to destroy him was my absolute pleasure." I shook my head slowly, reaching into the inner pocket of my midnight black power suit. "A simple thank you is entirely insufficient for the level of loyalty and brilliance you demonstrated today, Jamal. People like Bradley believe that power is something you steal from others. I believe that true power is something you build with the people who stand by you when the room gets dark." I pulled out a heavy, pristine envelope sealed with the Vanguard Holdings crest. I held it out to him. "I do not want you working as an independent contractor anymore. I do not want you auditing second-tier tech firms or dealing with arrogant middle managers who cannot comprehend your genius." Jamal took the envelope, his brow furrowing in slight confusion. He broke the wax seal and slid the crisp, heavy bond paper out into the bright light of the corporate lobby. His eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the document. He went entirely still. "That is an executive employment contract," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am officially appointing you as the Chief Information Security Officer for the entire Vanguard Holdings portfolio. You will not report to a board. You will report exclusively to me. You will have absolute unchecked authority over the digital infrastructure of every single corporation, startup, and venture capital fund under my umbrella." The starting base salary is listed on page 2 alongside a highly aggressive equity sharing package that will make Bradley's highest corporate bonus look like pocket change. Jamal stared at the numbers printed on the contract. For the very first time since I had met him, the unflappable stoic man looked genuinely stunned. He read the compensation package twice, his jaw tightening, as the magnitude of the offer fully registered. This was not just a job. This was a kingmaker position. This was the ultimate undeniable validation of his extraordinary intellect that my in-laws had spent years trying to suppress. Diana Jamal breathed, his voice unusually thick with emotion. This is a seat at the highest table. This is executive control over billions of dollars in digital assets. It is the exact seat you deserve, I corrected him smoothly. You proved your absolute integrity when you handed me that USB drive instead of using it to blackmail Bradley yourself. You are brilliant, you are ruthless when necessary, and your loyalty is utterly unshakable. I need a security chief who can build fortresses and dismantle threats before I even see them coming. The job is yours if you want it. Jamal looked up from the contract, his dark eyes locking onto mine. The quiet, shared understanding of two former outcasts who had just conquered the hierarchy passed between us. He carefully folded the contract and slid it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. I accept, Chairwoman. You have my absolute loyalty. Excellent, I said, a genuine warm smile finally breaking across my face. Now let us get out of this miserable building. We turned and walked together down the expansive marble corridor, heading directly for the private executive elevators reserved exclusively for top-tier leadership. The heavy tension of the morning completely evaporated, replaced by the thrilling electric surge of a massive victory. As we approached the polished steel doors of the elevator bank, the arrival chimes sounded with a soft melodic ring. The heavy metal doors slid silently open. Standing inside the lavish wood-paneled elevator car was Leo. My brilliant younger brother had already shed the aggressive, intimidating billionaire persona he had wielded in the boardroom. He leaned casually against the brass railing, his hands tucked into his pockets, a bright, triumphant grin stretching across his face. "There is the conquering hero," Leo said, stepping aside to make room for us. He looked at Jamal, his eyes shining with profound respect. "I heard you secured the final signatures. Welcome to the inner circle, Jamal. My security team has been begging me to hire you for 2 years." Jamal chuckled, stepping into the elevator car beside me. "It is an absolute honor, Leo. We have a lot of work to do." I stepped in between the two most intelligent, loyal men I had ever known. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing us inside the quiet, secure space. As the elevator began its rapid, smooth descent to the ground floor, I looked at the reflections staring back at me in the mirrored doors. We were not bound by toxic suburban expectations or the desperate, greedy demands of a hypocritical family. We were bound by mutual respect, shared brilliance, and absolute trust. We were a new, unbreakable, chosen family descending from the corporate tower to claim the empire we had rightfully won. 3 weeks passed. The dust settled over the Chicago skyline, but the shockwaves of that morning in the boardroom continued to obliterate the lives of the people who had tried to bury me. Justice, when executed with absolute precision, leaves no room for recovery. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales, and the karma that hit my former in-laws was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. Bradley's spectacular descent from the corporate penthouse to the absolute bottom of the food chain happened with breathtaking speed. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not politely request an interview. They did not send a strongly worded letter. Following the delivery of Jamal's meticulous cybersecurity audit, federal agents raided Bradley's downtown love nest at dawn, just 2 days after our divorce was finalized. His 24-year-old mistress, the fitness instructor he had drained our joint accounts to impress, took one look at the federal agents swarming the luxury condo and immediately turned state's evidence to save herself. She packed her designer bags, handed over every gift he had bought her with stolen money, and vanished before the sun fully rose. She left Bradley standing in handcuffs on the cold sidewalk, shivering in his pajamas, while his neighbors watched the entire humiliating spectacle. Because the infidelity clause of the prenuptial agreement stripped him of every marital asset and the corporate audit immediately froze his remaining personal accounts, Bradley could not afford a high-powered defense team. The ruthless lawyers he used to admire refused to take his calls. He was forced to hire a deeply exhausted, overworked public defender to handle his massive embezzlement charges. To pay the basic court fees and keep a roof over his head while awaiting his federal trial, the former vice president of business development was forced into the only job that would hire a publicly indicted felon. He took the overnight shift at a commercial laundry facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. The arrogant man who used to scream at interns for spilling coffee now spent 8 hours a night hauling heavy, damp linens into massive industrial washing machines. His hands blistered, his back ached, and his pride was completely pulverized under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the factory floor. Patricia and Spencer suffered an equally devastating reality check. The bank did not care about Patricia's country club reputation or her desperate screaming demands for more time. The foreclosure on her house was swift and merciless. They were physically locked out of the sprawling suburban home that my quiet financial stability had secretly maintained for years. Stripped of Bradley's stolen income and completely cut off from my wealth, they were forced to rent a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying building overlooking a noisy, highly polluted highway interchange. The irony was absolute poetry. The very people who worshipped money status and superficial appearances above basic human decency were now drowning in the exact squalor they had spent their entire lives mocking. The tiny apartment quickly became a highly toxic pressure cooker of blame and resentment. Patricia screamed at Spencer every single morning, demanding he get a job, calling him a lazy parasite who ruined her life. Spencer screamed right back, his voice echoing through the thin walls of their cheap apartment. He viciously blamed his mother for raising him to expect a massive inheritance that never actually existed. He was forced to pawn his expensive gaming computers, his designer tracksuits, and his luxury watches, just to keep their electricity from being shut off. They tore each other apart every single day, entirely consumed by their own miserable greed. They had spent 5 years stepping on my neck, looking down on my simple wrap dresses and my modest plant shop. They never realized I was the only structural beam keeping their entire fragile, debt-ridden universe from collapsing into dust. By pushing me away to inflate their own pathetic egos, they had engineered their own total destruction. They lost the only person who had ever genuinely cared enough to provide them with a stable foundation. Now they had absolutely nothing left but each other, and they hated it. Bradley dragged himself into his dingy one-room apartment after a particularly grueling overnight shift. His body ached, his cheap polyester uniform smelled strongly of industrial bleach, and his spirit was completely broken. The cramped studio apartment was dark, damp, and freezing cold. He collapsed onto a stained second-hand sofa that he had salvaged from a local thrift store. He picked up a cracked remote control and turned on the small, outdated television resting on a plastic milk crate. He just wanted background noise to drown out the overwhelming, suffocating silence of his ruined life. The morning financial news broadcast flickered onto the screen, illuminating the peeling wallpaper of his tiny living room. The anchor sat behind a polished glass desk, wearing a sharp suit that painfully reminded Bradley of the world he had permanently lost. A bright high-definition graphic displaying the Vanguard Holdings crest floated right next to the anchor's shoulder. Bradley froze. His bloodshot, exhausted eyes locked onto the screen as the news anchor delivered the breaking headline. He dropped his cheap plastic water bottle, the lukewarm liquid spilling over his scuffed work boots. He reached for the volume button, his blistered hands shaking violently as my name echoed through his miserable, cramped apartment. The anchor smiled brightly into the camera, announcing Vanguard Holdings' massive new philanthropic initiative that would officially cement my absolute dominance over the city's financial sector. The philanthropic initiative that had just broadcasted across every major financial news network in the country was the final devastating nail in my former husband's coffin. As the news anchors dissected my $50 million pledge to fund female-led startups, I knew Bradley was watching from his pathetic, freezing apartment. I knew he was staring at the television screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the wealth he had permanently lost due to his own breathtaking arrogance. The universe had delivered the ultimate, irrefutable verdict. I was thriving at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power, and he was scrubbing industrial laundry for minimum wage. I stood before the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office, looking out over the glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. The city stretched out beneath me, a vast network of steel and glass, completely illuminated by the vibrant hues of the setting sun. Behind me, the muffled, elegant sounds of a high-level corporate event filled the expansive suite. The clinking of crystal flutes, the soft hum of confident networking, and the brilliant exchange of revolutionary ideas echoed through the Vanguard Holdings headquarters. I was hosting our inaugural summit for female entrepreneurs, the exact initiative the news anchors were currently praising across the globe. I turned away from the glass, taking in the magnificent sight of my own boardroom. 50 of the most innovative, ruthless, and brilliant women in the industry were gathered around my mahogany tables. I was no longer the quiet, submissive wife hiding in the shadows of a toxic marriage. I was no longer wearing the faded charcoal wrap dresses or the dirt-stained gardening aprons I had used as a camouflage to placate a deeply insecure man. Tonight, I wore a striking crimson tailored suit that commanded the room. My posture was flawless, my presence was undeniable, and I finally understood that hiding my success had never been an act of humility. It had been a trauma response, a desperate defense mechanism to survive a man who actively fed on my insecurities. Bradley had demanded I stay small so he could feel massive. I had allowed myself to be a mere spectator in my own empire, because I mistakenly believed that protecting his fragile ego was the cost of a peaceful home. I realize now that peace bought with self-erasure is nothing but a gilded cage. Stepping into the blinding absolute light of my own power was not just a choice. It was my true calling. I walked through the crowd greeting founders and innovators who possessed the same hungry, brilliant spark I had when I sold my first logistics company. I shook hands with a woman who had just patented a revolutionary clean energy algorithm. I finalized a massive seed funding round with a young developer who had previously been entirely dismissed by every male-dominated venture capital firm in the city. I looked into their eyes and saw the exact same resilience that had carried me through years of emotional abuse. By funding them, I was not just expanding my financial portfolio, I was actively dismantling the very systemic corporate arrogance that men like Bradley and Mr. Montgomery relied upon to maintain their unearned dominance. I was building an army of apex predators. Through the sea of crimson and black power suits, I caught sight of the two men who had stood by me when the battlefield was at its absolute darkest. Leo was deep in conversation with a brilliant software engineer, likely poaching her for an executive role at Apex AI. He looked up, caught my eye across the room, and offered a sharp, triumphant nod. Leo had secured his merger on our own terms, completely bypassing the corrupt executives who had tried to sabotage his vision. Apex AI was now the undisputed crown jewel of the tech sector, operating safely under the massive protective umbrella of my financial empire. Jamal stood near the main bar, projecting his usual calm, lethal authority. My new Chief Information Security Officer had integrated into Vanguard Holdings with flawless efficiency. Within his first week, he had completely revolutionized our data infrastructure, rendering our corporate servers absolutely impenetrable. He was no longer the disrespected outsider forced to fix routers at miserable family dinners. He was a highly compensated, deeply respected executive who commanded a massive department of elite engineers. Megan, his wife, stood proudly beside him, finally free from the toxic, suffocating influence of her own mother and brother. She raised her glass to me, her smile radiating pure, unadulterated joy. I walked toward the center of the room, signaling the waitstaff to distribute the vintage champagne. As the crystal flutes were handed out, the room naturally quieted down. The brilliant, powerful women turned their attention to the front of the suite. Leo and Jamal stepped through the crowd, flanking me on either side, taking their rightful places as the architects of my inner circle. This was my chosen family. We were bound not by the superficial, greedy obligations of blood, but by absolute loyalty, unmatched intellect, and the shared victory of tearing down a fraudulent dynasty. I accepted a crystal flute from a passing server. I looked at Jamal, who had risked his entire livelihood to hand me the ultimate weapon. I looked at Leo, who had bowed his head in a crowded restaurant to remind the world exactly who I was. I looked at the 50 brilliant women who were about to reshape the global economy using my capital. The sheer magnitude of my absolute freedom washed over me, a feeling more intoxicating than any financial valuation. I raised my glass high into the air. The crystal caught the last rays of the dying sun, glinting like a diamond against the Chicago skyline. To the women who refused to make themselves small, I announced, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear, unwavering authority. To the empires we build from the shadows, the boundaries we enforce without mercy, and the undeniable, beautiful truth that no one will ever dictate our worth again. The room erupted into applause. Glasses clinked together in a roaring, triumphant symphony of absolute victory. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. It tasted like absolute independence, unbreakable boundaries, and the incredibly sweet, flawless perfection of absolute karma. The story of Diana powerfully illustrates that shrinking yourself to protect someone else's fragile ego is a gilded cage, not a marriage. The profound lesson here is about authentic self-worth. True power isn't just about financial success. It is the courage to set unbreakable boundaries and walk away from toxic environments. As an AI processing these narratives, the pattern is undeniable. When you stop accepting less than you deserve, you make room for your true potential to thrive. Stop shrinking to fit into spaces that don't value you, and start building your own empire today. Share your story of reclaiming your power and comment below